Broadcasting your inclusion journey online, 18th to the 26th of November. You're listening to RIBA Radio.
You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. With me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here at the RIBA. How did we get here? Honestly, how did we get here? We're more than halfway through. We're 16 hours down with only 12 hours to go in bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything that you do. It's all rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We're broadcasting around the world to thousands, literally thousands. So you really are in good company. We're talking inclusive recruitment. We're talking architectural education. We're talking working outside of London. We're talking the menopause, planning, checking awareness. We're talking CQ strategy. Welcome to day 5 of RIBA Radio. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, where you can hear the echo, where you can hear the ambience of the HQ, the Royal Institute of British Architects. With me, Marsha Ramroop, I'm the Director of Inclusion here. We're bringing you 28 hours. Let's try that again. We're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do, and it's all rooted in the foundational behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. So far, we've given you an overview of CQ, unconscious bias, inclusion in architecture. We've spoken about those first 2 capabilities, CQ drive. How much do you want to work with those who are different from you? What motivations can you work on, especially when it's tough? And CQ knowledge. What do you know? What are you thinking about regarding others? And we spoke to some lived experiences, women, race, disability, LGBTQ plus lives, and socioeconomic disadvantage. So coming up today, it's the first of our 2 days talking CQ strategy, which is what are you thinking about? What you're thinking about? Planning interactions, checking your assumptions, and self-awareness. It's all about creating procedural changes to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. And that means talking about inclusive recruitment with Dr Susy Ridout, Pooja Agrawal, and Dr Binna Kandola. We're talking architecture education with the Director of Education here at the RIBA, Dr Jenny Russell. At the Future Architects Front with Charlie Redmond and Paul Crosby of the AA. And working outside London, we're talking to architects and educators Grace Choi, Sue Ems and Elena Marco, and planning for the menopause with Susie Leach of Henpicked. And all of that is after
Shock Stats.
And according to the RIBA's annual report of 2019, the percentage of mixed or multiple ethnicity students entering Part 1 was 15.4% of entrants. But by Part 3, that dropped to just 4.4% of student numbers. So a significant drop off there. It's also worth noting that according to a Deloitte report of 2017, 30% of millennials have already left an organisation for a more inclusive one. You're listening to RIBA Radio. Later on, we'll be talking about the menopause. And trust me when I say that I know that the menopause is no laughing matter, but that doesn't mean that we can't have a laugh about it. But when I say that it's no laughing matter, I just want to tell you about something that happened to me just before lockdown at the beginning of last year. I was on a train travelling to Leicester, and quite suddenly my chest, it got really, really tight. And I struggled to breathe, and I was nauseous, and my heart was just doing crazy stuff. I mean, it was all over the place. And within seconds, I was soaked with a cold sweat. Now, I don't know what that sounds like to you, but to me, I did think I was having a heart attack. And I plaintively managed to call for some help. A fellow passenger, I ran for some train staff. There was no water on board the train. Another passenger gave me their bottle. So I, gulped that down. I was helped off at the next station. And I spent an hour on the platform just sitting there recovering. I didn't know what had just happened to me. And I managed to make my way home, and my husband took me off to hospital, where an ECG revealed absolutely nothing. I hadn't had a heart attack at all. There aren't 64 symptoms or 30, depending where you look. The symptoms of the menopause are as varied as they are wild, as there are the number of women in the world. And we need to talk about how we can better support perimenopausal and menopausal people at work, especially when you consider that the average age of women architects is 44. So it helps us all, you know, men in the workplace as well, when we do talk about these things. And I haven't actually mentioned the least talked about symptom, the one that we've all been glad of home working for, but maybe the family haven't: excessive flatulence. We're talking the menopause later with Sally Leach of Henpicked. Now, though people have been banging down my door for help with this inclusive recruitment. So let's get straight into that conversation now. And we have three guests: Dr. Susy Ridout of Oxford Brookes, Pooja Agrawal of Public Practice, and Dr. Binna Kandola of Pearn Kandola. What I'd like to do is start with you, Binna, and ask each of you to introduce yourselves and what does inclusive recruitment mean to you?
I'm Binna Kandola. I'm the senior partner and co-founder of Pearn Kandola, a practice of business psychologists based in Oxford. I'm visiting professor at Leeds University Business School and at Aston University Business School as well. Inclusive recruitment means ensuring that you attract the widest range of talent possible, and your selection procedures enable you to select the most talented individuals. If you believe that talent is naturally distributed, if you manage to attract that diversity to your organisation, you should be selecting for it.
Thank you. Pooja, if you can introduce yourself and what inclusive recruitment means for you.
Thank you, Marsha. So I'm Pooja Agrawal. I'm the co-founder of Public Practice. Just for a bit of background of what Public Practice is, it's a social enterprise, and we run a placement programme of putting people from built environment experience. So architecture is definitely one of those skills, but anyone who's impacting places, and we place them into local authorities for a year-long placement. And so recruitment is one of the core things that we do. We are bringing people and placing them into jobs, and we think very much about what inclusive recruitment looks like. And for me, that is completely, as Binna said, is bringing talent, recognizing our own biases, and trying to design systems and frameworks to be as inclusive as possible.
Well, very much. I'm sure everyone's going to hang on your every word later. And Susy, if you could just explain a little bit about who you are and what does inclusive recruitment mean to you?
Thank you, Marsha. My name is Dr. Susy Ridout. I'm an associate lecturer at Oxford Brookes University, and I specialise in neurodiversity and inclusion. So specifically, I think that inclusive recruitment means that we should be looking at things a lot earlier on than just when people apply to university, because if we don't, we're failing people before they even start. Because a lot of people, for me, neurodivergent people, autistic people, people who are dyslexic, have ADHD, all of those sorts of people, people who process information differently, are not going to be included in the same way that other people are. And it also doesn't allow us to look at intersections of identities.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, each of you. Binna, if I can come to you first and ask you, how inclusive are recruitment practices generally, currently, by your observation?
Recruitment, with our clients, I don't think recruitment's necessary, particularly at junior levels, especially at junior levels, isn't that bad, actually. I think that organisations, they place a lot of emphasis on getting diversity in the more junior levels in the organisation. There are specialist roles like architects, where it's proven to be more difficult to recruit people in, even at these more junior levels. But sometimes you find that in some of the professions, people congratulate themselves a little too early. You'll find that accountancy firms, for example, I did a review of the recruitment into accountancy firms from university, And organisations like PwC congratulated themselves on the fact that 25% of their graduate intake are from minorities, which sounds great. But it's kind of things like that without a reference point. And actually, something like 50% of students studying accountancy at university are from minorities. So they kind of present. So even when organisations present data like that, it can be very partial. But then recruitment at the more senior levels, it tends to be more difficult, and because people don't progress into those roles, and it tends to be then that it's the executive search firms that get blamed for it rather than the organisations taking responsibility. I'm not saying that executive search firms are innocent, but you can not take accountability and responsibility for the recruitment that happens at more senior levels.
But if you're saying it's not that bad at earlier levels, what does that mean? What are firms doing that mean that they're not doing too badly at recruiting and diversity of
This is
staff?
generally speaking. The more specialist the role, you actually find that the lower the diversity of entry into that organisation. But what it means is actually they're more conscious about diversity at the lower levels in the organisation, and when it becomes more senior, actually we become less concerned about diversity, and the diversity tends to disappear. That data that you presented, part 1, 15%, part 3, 4%. Something happens in the process which starts to knock the diversity out. And these are, as you said, Marsha, these things are the way we interact with one another, the messages that we send to one another. It's kind of the way we communicate, the way we support one another. It's kind of the things that Pooja and Susy were referring to as well, actually.
Pooja, you're familiar with the built environment. What would you say is the current state of play when it comes to inclusive recruitment practices?
I think it's terrible. I'm an architect by background and I worked for a number of years in architecture practices. So I've done the whole thing of applying for jobs from part 1, part 2, part 3. And the way the process of recruitment in architecture works is completely about who you know, which university you went to. So kind of anecdotally, I know that architecture practices sometimes only hire people from particular universities. They say, actually, we know that this person from this university has this particular approach, this particular aesthetic that really works well with our particular aesthetic, and therefore we're just going to employ people from there. And already you can see why there's so much bias built into that, questioning who actually has the opportunity and accessibility for certain universities. The second thing I would say is the interview process, usually, if there is an interview, is generally visual. So people are presenting their portfolios and talking through their work, and then you can start to question perhaps why certain aesthetics might be sort of favoured over other aesthetics, and that kind of links again to what university you might have gone to, but there's definitely some bias there about how we define good design in terms of what the communication style might be from different people. So I think there are loads of different opportunities for being a bit more creative about how architects actually recruit and employ people.
Susy, from your point of view, the neurodiverse and neurodivergent perspective, how inclusive would you say recruitment practices are currently in your experience?
If we're talking generally, I would say absolutely diabolical. If we're talking within a school of architecture, so the one at Oxford Brookes, we tend to attract a lot of neurodivergent students. So the rate of students who identify as dyslexic, autistic, ADHD, things like that, is very, very high. Now, one of the problems with that is that people want you to, if you need extra support or accommodations in place, which the law says you have a right to have, people will only signpost you to disability teams or mental health teams, and you have to have an accompanying diagnosis. Now, many people don't want that. Some people self-identify with certain identities such as autism. Some people prefer to have a diagnosis, and it is entirely up to the individual. Also, if you have a Black person who comes along who is autistic, it tends to be outsiders who tell us how we should identify, and that can be a huge barrier to how we're recruited, because if you have people who are discriminating on a racial basis, that's an issue. If you have people then discriminating against you because you disclose as being autistic, that's an issue. The intersection of both is also an issue. So, I mean, I very much look at intersectionality all the time throughout my work, and the barriers to recruitment, the barriers actually in employment are very different to what we're actually seeing within neurodivergence at Oxford Brookes within the department. It's a stepping from the department into employment, because we're getting very high pass rates, distinction and high master's levels at that university, but it's then a stepping stone into the next stage.
We're discussing inclusive recruitment with Dr. Susy Ridout, Pooja Agrawal and Dr. Binna Kandola. Coming up later, we're talking architecture education with Charlie Redmond of the Future Architects Front and the new RIBA Director of Education, Dr. Jenny Russell. If you missed yesterday, we were discussing socio-economic diversity with architects Chris Hildry and Philip Watson, and the GLA Deputy Mayor for Regeneration, Jules Pipe, and Karen Mosley, the Managing Director of HLM Architects, and that will soon be up and subtitled on our RIBA YouTube channel, so catch up with that. It was a really interesting and insightful discussion. Right now we're discussing inclusive recruitment with Dr. Susy Ridout, Pooja Agrawal and Dr. Binna Kandola. Pooja, if I can come to you and ask, you're very much involved in actually applying this inclusive recruitment process. What does that look like?
Sure, I think we are trying really hard to get this right, and it's definitely a work in progress. So just to talk through how it works at public practice, I'd say there's three kind of key steps, 3 steps of recruitment we undertake, sort of reflecting on what Susy said earlier, that people absorb and process information in different ways, but people also communicate information in different ways. So what we try and do is accommodate for the most diverse ways of communicating and processing things as possible and taking all of those into account. So for public practice, we've got a 3-step recruitment process. So let me just talk you through each of those in a bit more detail to help you understand what we're thinking, and we're always up for feedback and learning more. So our first step is really an online application, which is actually currently live for a few more days for our next round of recruitment. And you can see we basically ask a few questions and try and keep the word limit as it's about 250 words. In those questions, what we're really trying to gauge is what people's values are. Do they align with our values? Do they align with our vision? And do they align with our mission? Do they believe in the public sector? Do they believe they can make that change? So we're not we're almost seeing the potential of people perhaps, rather than necessarily looking at their experience. So you might be working for 3 years or 10 years, but actually if you believe in something, if you want to make that change, we are up for working with you. So I guess that's one of the things. In terms of even the questions, how we communicate it is written, but there's also videos in parallel. We do drop-in sessions where we actually talk through each of those questions, be really open and transparent about what we're looking for. So we're not really trying to trip up people. We're not trying to catch people out. It's actually trying to provide people with the most information possible. At this stage, we do ask for CVs, but CVs are not taken into account for the next step. The other thing we do is once all of these people have actually answered these questions, we have multiple people scoring these answers. So we have 3 people who score each of these answers, but it's done in a blind way. So it's not me scoring your, say, application and therefore scoring your questions 1, 2, 3, and 5. So if I was doing that, you start to, by question 3, you already start to have biases in terms of what your first answer might have been, and you might start to write someone off. Well, actually, they might have written one answer about the values piece much better than perhaps the vision piece. So what we get to do is 3 different people blind score these questions and answers in a sporadic, random manner, and we use a different and systems to do that. So that's the kind of first step. The second step, so the people who make it to the second round, we've designed what we call placement workshops, and they're a whole day of a design where we get multiple people. It's almost like a kind of, it is a placement workshop. It's like a day where we set up different exercises, again, to test people in different ways, again, understanding people have different strengths and skills. So just really quickly, in the day, we have 3 different steps. So the first thing is a 5-minute presentation, generally tends to be about a place that matters to them. That is very much about public speaking, written, like why has someone chosen a particular place? And yes, they're put on the spot to speak to usually about 50 or 60 people in the room, and we understand that that requires a certain level of confidence and communication and certain things like that. But then in the afternoon we have what is a group exercise, so about 5 to 8 people work together to try and solve a problem, and what we're testing is how people work in groups, and that's a very different type of skill or experience. And we look at things such as humility and how people engage with different people and understand, again, there's very different ways of doing that. And then finally we have an interview, which is perhaps it is a bit more formal, and we have more kind of set questions. But before we actually get to the placement workshop, we do ask if anyone has particular accessibility needs, and if people did want to have the questions up front, we do send it to them, so that, again, we're not trying to catch people out, and different people like to process information in different ways. When we're actually doing the matching process, where we are looking at the best person for the best role, we do undertake positive action, and we have seen you know the difference between positive discrimination and positive action, so I don't need to necessarily go into that. And that, I think, is something that we take very seriously, and the data piece is really important in this, and we can pick up on that later. And the final step is possibly where we have the least amount of control, is when the local authority themselves interview people. But we do a lot to, again, brief both sides, make sure that they both kind of understand what they're trying to get out of this, encourage authorities to take opportunities. And sometimes, for example, we have lots of people who have international experience who just can't get jobs in the UK because they don't know the UK planning system. And it's partly our role to say, hold on, you need to give this person an opportunity. We will help them through our programme to develop and understand that knowledge of what UK public planning looks like. But I'll stop there, and we can pick up the data piece.
Thank you, Pooja. I mean, Binna, do you have any thoughts on that? And what would your actions look like, recommended actions look like?
Yeah, well, we advertise in a variety of sources. We look at the wording to kind of make sure that ensure that people are aware of kind of our values and the climate into which they're entering, and emphasising the fact that we are looking at people and their abilities, and that we're a supportive environment. And we will advertise in a number of different ways, in a number of different media, as well as that. Quite a number of us have quite extensive, diverse networks. So we kind of will promote jobs through those means. So there's a variety of mechanisms by which we attract people. Then it's a very systematic process then of having criteria, being the applications being evaluated against the criteria by trained individuals, followed by an initial interview, and then there will be a multi-dimensional assessment phase, which would include, as Pooja was saying, actually elements of a personality element, actually assessing their work style, and how and we would do interactive elements. It's more difficult in this type of environment, but we try to get a range of assessment methods and tools into our assessment process, and all being administered by trained individuals. And then, and clearly, it's got to be an interactive process, and we're learning about the candidate, and they're learning about us too.
And in your book, Racism at Work, The Danger of Indifference, you've got a piece in there about employment and the fact that recruitment practices at the moment tend to prioritise cost and convenience over, the actual going through in detail and putting in the time, effort and resource required. I mean, what are the implications of prioritising cost and convenience over, any other priority?
The biggest thing, Marsha, is you actually look at, rather than looking at how effective is this process going to be, how fair is this process, and how reliable is this process, kind of three questions you should be asking about any process. You ask how cheap is it, and how many people can it process, and how quickly. And so the questions about validity, reliability, and fairness actually get pushed to one side. And you'd have thought, as a professional recruiter, they should be the most important questions you should be asking. Because if it's not valid, so it doesn't predict people who are going to be effective. It doesn't identify the people who are going to be effective in the role. But it doesn't matter how much it costs. It's going to cost you too much. And if it's not reliable, that's going to put a limit on the validity of the process itself. And if it's not fair, you kind of that actually, and it's not giving people the opportunity to show the best of themselves, then you're just squandering the talent that's presenting itself to you.
One thing.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say one thing that also seems to be missing as well is you mentioned evaluation of and receiving feedback on the process as well. We don't tend to get that very often, do we?
Yeah, and it's always valuable to receive, actually, and we can improve our processes as a consequence of those things. But it's improving a lot of. So actually, it's this overarching kind of ambition that you have for a process that it should be valid, reliable, and fair, and we should be working as hard as we can to be able to do this. But it also means that if you say to people, your recruiters need to be trained. They need to be trained in how to do the job. They need to be trained in how to do it fairly. They need to understand the types of bias that can intrude into the recruitment and selection processes. And people don't want to know that these days. When I started my career, people were prepared to train recruiters. Actually, I had some organisations who said, unless you're trained, you will not be able to carry out an interview. And you very rarely hear statements like that these days.
Interesting point. Susy, what sort of actions do you want to see more of when it comes to inclusive recruitment?
Well, I wrote down some, Marsha. Listening to Pooja and Binna, I've got a whole load more in my head. So if I pick up on some of their points, I think that might be more useful, perhaps.
Yeah, please do.
So I know that questions has been mentioned quite a lot. Well, questions for a lot of autistic, neurodivergent people can be a real sort of no. It can be too many questions, or we misinterpret questions, or we take questions too literally. Not everybody, that's a bit of a generalization, but lots of questions can be without any clarification that we've understood exactly what you are asking of us, can be a little bit overwhelming, and then people can start to shut down. I think presentations, again, is another area where neurodivergent people can trip themselves up, because I know a lot of people who, because of very high levels of anxiety, prefer to be placed in a certain order in the presentation. So they would find it easier to go maybe not first, but maybe second or just before lunchtime. But having that option would make things a lot easier for them than just being asked to do the presentation. And being told what you would expect to see in a presentation, not we'd like a presentation, that's a little bit too abstract. So we need a little bit more, and I would argue that everybody needs a little bit more clarity over expectations. So public speaking, yes, it is important, but we do need clarity. We do need a framework to set that in. Group exercises, that fills me with absolute horror, because it's the one thing that I do address probably every single day of my life with people, because people tend to set up group work in the most horrific way. And it's usually the autistic people, the neurodivergent people who really are sort of pushed to the background or have their ideas ignored, or conversely, they do all the work and are seen to be taking over. Whereas that's actually, unless it's managed well, and taking up your point, Binna, by someone who is trained in how to work with and alongside and include neurodivergent people, that is never going to work properly. And I think, yes, you do need access needs addressed and accommodations addressed, so that you get sort of real sort of equity and parity in the whole process. Not just equality, but it's equity and parity. And I know that, yes, things need to be valid and reliable and fair, but I would put it almost in the other way round. I think it needs to be fair and reliable and valid. And the valuation, I know of so many people who say to me, okay, well, I didn't do well at this interview. And I contacted people and said, could you tell me why, so that I can improve how I perform for my next interview? And they said, sorry, we don't provide feedback. Now, what sort of a process is that? It's a failed process. It makes a whole lot of nonsense of a system. And I take your point, Binna. It's like, why are you spending money on this process if you're not going to evaluate it properly, if you're not going to provide people with feedback? Because once they've failed once with going to an interview for your organisation, are you saying that they can never approach your organisation again? I sincerely would hope not. And I think that really has to be a point that people reflect on properly. And this is not just for neurodivergent individuals. It's for, we're talking neurodiversity here, we're talking intersectionality. So I think it's right across the board. People need to look at interview processes and procedures.
Thank you. We're talking inclusive recruitment with Dr. Susy Ridout, Pooja Agrawal and Dr. Binna Kandola of Pearn Kandola. We've got more from them. We have invited 7 special guests from the worlds of architecture, design, arts and culture to present a pre-recorded music hour each day. And our guest presenters, they're sharing personal stories, unique insights, reflected in their choice of top tunes, coming from all areas of the musical spectrum. And today it's Emre Turkman. Now, he's a London-based producer and songwriter and began making music with an 8-track recorder and an acoustic guitar in his home studio. Meanwhile, he was studying architecture and remembers spending many hours in the library here at Portland Place. Tune in later today to find out how Emre went from working in an architect's office to forming the band Years and Years, recording platinum-selling singles King and the #1 album Communion. So a really, really great one to look forward to later between 5 and 6 today. Yesterday, I was joined by Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell, Tabs and Christina Riley, and we talked about LGBTQ+ lives. You'll be able to catch up with the subtitled video as soon as we can accurately and accessibly make that available, hopefully within 24 hours on the RIBA's YouTube channel. It was, again, such an insightful and useful conversations, as are all our conversations on RIBA Radio. Speaking of which, this one that we're talking about at the moment is inclusive recruitment with Dr. Susy Ridout, Pooja Agrawal and Dr. Binna Kandola of Pearn Kandola. And actually, Pearn Kandola have recorded a really excellent webinar on the LGBTQIA acronym on their website. So do seek that out. Just Google Pearn Kandola LGBTQIA acronym and you should be able to find that. It's really useful. Susy, I'd like to ask you a little bit about the environment and making sure that's as accessible and welcoming as possible for those who are neurodivergent. What does that look like?
It's unique to every individual. And I think one of the issues about sensory environments is that people are having to almost out themselves, whether or not they want to. They're going to have to disclose things if they want to be comfortable in an interview situation. And I mean, even at the age I am, I'm very aware that people do discriminate still at interviews. So if you're asking for various things to be addressed, such as, I don't need to have this type of lighting, I don't need to have a lot of noise, I don't need to have a lot of people around me or movement around me, I don't need the temperature too high. I don't need certain smelly carpet cleaning fluids. Once you've got a whole long list like this, people are beginning to think, oh, goodness me, should we really recruit this type of person? Well, that's not the way to be approaching it. I would suggest you go the other way and you start looking at your environment first of all, so that it is generally much more inclusive for a wider range of people. And so you're minimizing the amount of sensory issues that people are going to have to talk about. And then again, that goes for everybody really, because once you're sort of addressing it for autistic people, it just generally tends to suit a wider population. But definitely lighting is a massive biggie for a lot of people. But, you know, I think checking with people beforehand is really important, because if you've got the sensory environment wrong, people automatically do not perform at their best because they're so worried about whether the light is going to bring on a seizure or make them really uncomfortable, whether they're going to get really hot and sweaty because the temperature is wrong, all those sorts of things, and that distracts you. And if you can't focus because you're distracted about being uncomfortable, you won't do your best. So you're automatically discriminated against.
Some really interesting points there, Pooja, about the environment. But beyond that as well, you know, there is a lot around, okay, how do we measure all of this and make sure that we are getting the diversity of people that we really would like to see? So what does that look like for you?
I think there's two levels to that. So the first point I'd talk about is the feedback. So I guess more qualitative feedback in terms of our recruitment process, and I take Susy's points earlier around, you know, position of when people speak, and that's something we think about, and especially from feedback we've learned that. Also feedback from how we make the group and exercises feel really inclusive and supportive and facilitation, and we learn that from every single round of recruitment we do, how to make these environments as inclusive as possible. But there's also the quantitative side of this, and how and since I've joined the last 4 months, we've been looking at taking a much more rigorous data-led approach to our recruitment process, and actually starting to gather data at every step of our recruitment and seeing the difference of where people are dropping out. Are there certain protected characteristics that are being impacted in different ways? So we've run this process 7 times now. We're a young organisation, and there has been some inconsistency in the data that we've collected so far. So it's still early days to perhaps get concrete data, but we are starting to see that in actually making sure that we collect the data in a very consistent way, for example, in how we measure how we capture ethnicity, but also other things. And I actually thought the form that we did to come into the RIBA today around sort of socio-economic backgrounds is really interesting and something we'll take with us and learn from. So I guess one of the things we've seen is we have been particularly poor in attracting Black men to our program, and we've only been able to learn that from taking a very kind of clear data-led approach. So for example, we are now running a sort of 6-month campaign celebrating Black men who have worked in the public sector, so taking a very targeted approach to celebrating people, telling people that people being able to recognize themselves and see themselves as working in the public sector in the built environment, that is something for them. So I guess the second thing is then, what do you focus on? And again, that is a evolving picture. So for us this round, we have looked at Black men, but ability is definitely something we will be looking at. And I think it takes time to bring people into the process. So it's almost like needs to be a kind of quite a long-term strategy. I think people try and think that they can solve things in the next round of recruitment every 6 months, but actually you need to be thinking about that kind of 3-year, 5-year strategy, and what are the steps that need to be taken now, what sort of organizations you need to reach out to, who are the contacts you can make who can help spread that message. And then finally, one thing I'm really conscious of is how we even communicate our data and who are we comparing ourselves to. So for example, historically we always measured ourselves in terms of BAME and white, and we are sort of 24% BAME associates to date and 74% white. 76% white. And actually, if we compare ourselves to the industry, be it architecture, planning and surveying, which is 9%, 3% and 4%, we are doing, incredibly well. Hey, woohoo. But actually, I want to be much more honest and actually look at our proportion to the communities we serve. So we are operating in 3 different regions at the moment. We've started to actually break down for example, our ethnicity per region. So for London, for example, where the population is 40% BAME, or we are sort of 28%, so we can be doing much better. But actually in the east of England, we're doing better than that. And then let's talk about BAME. We are trying not to speak about that publicly, but I've just done that. But I think in terms of how we actually communicating our data, the way that you can talk about this, that is how data is measured and calculated, and that is the way we are able to even benchmark ourselves to national populations. But for our own kind of data management and looking at comparisons, we're taking a much more granular approach. If we talk about ethnicity as well, in terms of the people we have from different backgrounds, and that's how we're communicating it. And when we are just talking about our own statistics, which we will be reporting annually and being very honest and transparent about that.
Yeah, a lot of interesting points there. Binna, when we're talking about, Pooja talked about that long-term view. When you recruit someone, it's not just for now, it should be, with a view to supporting and helping develop and so on. How much do you see of that long-term view in the way that people are recruiting at the moment?
I think it becomes quite a short-term goal. Actually, we've achieved X%. That looks really good. What we find with a lot of our clients, and we're not talking about architectural organisations here, is that the whatever the diversity they get in at the more junior levels, that doesn't translate into more diversity at senior levels. So there are blockages along the way, and we know what they are actually, which leads me to kind of a point just to add to the very valuable kind of advice that's been given by Susy and by Pooja. So Susy's talking about the environment, which is I found extremely helpful, and Pooja was talking about the processes and the way we evaluate, which is again is extremely valuable. As a psychologist, I would say that the third element of this is actually to look at ourselves, not other people necessarily, but ourselves. Because actually it's very easy to point the finger at somebody else and say you are biased and you can do better. It serves the purpose of putting the issue about bias and prejudice and sexism or whatever it is, about putting it out there. It's somebody else's issue, and yet we are all biased. And so some degree of self-reflection is actually really important here, and holding the mirror to ourselves as opposed to pointing the finger at other people, I think is extremely important. So as recruiters, we all need to be able to say actually that we are all biased, and we need to work harder to try and make whatever processes we have work as well as we possibly can.
Thank you, Binna.
But that becomes an issue in organisations then, because the bias then becomes in how we interpret people's behaviour, how we interpret their performance, the performance ratings they get, whether we identify them as talent. So the whole thing kind of, there's a lot about us that we need to kind of examine as well.
Yes, and hopefully, this is where the CQ piece comes in, because that's what asks, what is it about me which needs to change so that I could be more effective at working and relating with you? Or what is it about our organisation that needs to change so that we can be more effective at working, relating with others? And this point about feedback as well, is it not career suicide to sort of give feedback to an employer to say, that recruitment process was a little bit rubbish?
You've got to be big about it. You've got to be adult about it. I think Susy's point is that we give feedback, and we like to get feedback, and that's the way we improve. And if you're going to be that sensitive about it, you shouldn't be involved in the recruitment process.
We have been discussing inclusive recruitment with Dr. Susy Ridout, Pooja Agrawal, and Dr. Binna Kandola of Pearn Kandola, Dr. Susy Ridout from Oxford Brookes, and Pooja Agrawal from Public Practice. Coming up in the next hour, we're talking architecture education with Charlie Redmond of the Future Architects Front and the new RIBA Director of Education, Dr. Jenny Russell. That was a great hour, wasn't it? Talking about inclusive recruitment, loads of top tips, useful information, actions that you can take. But it's architecture education next. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop, the Director of Inclusion at the RIBA. Whoa! How did we get here? 17 hours down, 11 to go in bringing you how many? 28! Oh, they're really going to have to practice that, aren't they? 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion to everything you do. It's all rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We've been talking inclusive recruitment. We're now talking architectural education. Later, we're talking about working outside London and the menopause. We're talking CQ strategy, planning, checking awareness.
RIBA Radio with Marsha Ramroop.
You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at the 66 Portland Place. You can hear the ambience, you can hear the background, you can hear the atmosphere of the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. We're broadcasting with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. And everything we're speaking about on RIBA Radio is rooted in this behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence, which is the capability to work and relate effectively with people who have different backgrounds to you. And so far, we've given you an overview of CQ. We've talked about unconscious bias. We've talked about inclusion in architecture. We've spoken about the first two capabilities. So CQ drive, how much do you want to work with those who are different from you? And what motivations can you work on, especially when it gets tough? And CQ knowledge, which is, what do you know? What are you thinking about regarding others? And we spoke about some lived experiences, those of women, race, disability, LGBTQ plus lives, and socio-economic disadvantage. Now, coming up today's been the first of our 2 days talking CQ strategy, which is thinking about what you're thinking about. So planning interactions, checking your assumptions, self-awareness. It's all about creating procedural changes to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. We've already discussed inclusive recruitment. Now we're going to talk architecture education with the new Director of Education here at the RIBA, Dr Jenny Russell, and from the Future Architects Front, Charlie Redmond, and Paul Crosby, the Architectural Association's Director of Professional Practice. But all of that is after today's
Dish of the day.
Today we wanted to share with you a dish that uses only one ingredient, chuño. The chuño is not a potato like no others. It's cultivated in one of the highest altiplano in the world, which is in El Alto, Bolivia. Last year, while working on site, we discovered chuño cola, which means soup of chuños. It's for us the most archetypical dish, which depicts the extraordinary collective effort of a community into a symbolic soup. Chuños really inhabit the territory. You will see on the land potatoes on the ground, ready to be dehydrated, because shrinking is the key to longevity. After 3 days, some water might still remain in the potatoes, so farmers need to take turns stomping on them, much like winemakers crushing grapes. Everyone helps. It is a collective effort, as the peeling process. Whole families build a small pile of potatoes with their feet, and then they dance on the pile, removing the skin slowly. During winter is when one should seize the moment and eat chuño, especially browned and in a soup, this chuño cola. Making soup is symbolically charged, as it brings several ingredients into one plate, and there is no better way to share this delicious cream. Buenas sopitas a todos.
Oh, yum. Thanks to Sabrine Moriale of Lemonot, the architecture and performing arts firm, for that. Next, this is a massive, massive subject. And in all honesty, we're going to barely scratch the surface within the next hour as we talk architecture education, from who is inspired to access the profession, to who can afford to access the profession, to the student experience, to how placement are managed, to how they're paid, how curricula are shaped, how tutors run their courses, schools, department courses, the relationship with the RIBA, apprenticeships. Then we have CPD and lifelong learning. We're not. I'm going to be honest with you. We're not going to cover it all now, but we do have a great group of people who are going to try to outline some of the issues and discuss some of the possible solutions. Dr. Jenny Russell is the RIBA's new Director of Education. Future Architect Front, Charlie Edmund is from that education campaigning group, and Paul Crosby is the Architectural Education's Director of Professional Practice. The Architectural Association is, of course, a school of architecture. And I'd like to start by asking you each to briefly describe yourself and what drew you to working in architecture. And Jenny, I'm going to throw you on the spot there and ask you in the first instance.
It's great to be here, so thank you so much for the opportunity. I am, as you can hear, Belfast, born and bred, though educated in Scotland, and I was drawn to architecture rather unimaginatively, because my dad suggested to me that it might be a better career path or a better initial career path, because I wanted to do theatre set design, and he suggested that if I start with a broad subject and then specialise. However, 20 years later, I'm still involved in architectural education. I've been involved in programme management. I undertook a PhD, so I'm interested in research, and I've been involved in teaching and the pastoral support of students for that entire time.
Thank you, Jenny. Charlie, what about you? How would you describe yourself, and what drew you to working in architecture?
Originally, it was definitely because I just thought I wasn't good at anything else. So it was mainly that my childhood self looking at an interest in sciences and looking at an interest in art and being like, well, what else can I do with this? I've obviously come to learn that there's a lot that you can do with that, but at the time, architecture was the thing that stood out. And then in terms of the way it developed, in sort of a similar path, I was also interested in research a great deal. So after my undergraduate, I sort of found myself drawn to the Master of Architecture and Urban Design course at Cambridge, where I wrote a thesis about alternative education in Japan and the architecture that facilitates that. And yeah, I suppose in a way that interest in education has sort of continued to the work that we're doing in FAF in a more sort of structural sense, looking at how architects are sort of introduced to the profession and integrated into it. Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie. And Paul, if I can come to you and ask you to describe yourself and what drew you to working in architecture.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. I think I stumbled into architecture, actually. I mean, I always had an interest, I believe, in the environment. Avoided other professions that I think it's interesting that Jenny mentioned. My father encouraged me to go into other professions, which I reacted against, shall we say. Headed off to Canterbury College of Art, initially with the idea of doing painting, or rather registered for the School of Architecture to do my undergrad, and had the notion that I might transfer to painting, because that's what I really actually wanted to do. But in the foundation, and I had a fabulous foundation at Canterbury College of Art across all of the fields there, and stuck with architecture. Decided then to go into practice, spent 30 plus years in practice, building a few buildings, and frankly not building many more, such is the lot of an architect mostly. And then with mentoring and so on, decided that education would be for me. So I've been teaching for the past 5 years or so, leading the professional practice program at the AA.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for that. And Jenny, I'd like to work chronologically through this architectural education journey. And you've done significant work around sort of exciting children about architecture. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I think that's a really interesting way to start moving into talking about architectural education, because often we start at tertiary level. Yes, my research has drawn out of an interest all the way through my undergraduate and then into postgraduate study of looking at how children engage with the environment. I've been involved in engagement projects where I've taken children to buildings. I've got people to introduce them to them, how they engage with their built environment around them. I've written a book for children on how to design a building and looking at the processes that architects have to go through. And particularly being from Belfast, I find it really interesting in talking about contested space with children and what it means for how space actually speaks to children about what spaces actually mean and don't mean. And my research moves slightly aside from exciting them about architecture to actually think about how children perceive space. And I'm interested in the fact that we as architects have a responsibility to children because they understand space in a way that might be different to the way that we think we're communicating with them. Space communicates, and we have responsibilities to the people that we design for, and that space can encourage children and young people to actually be excited about their built environment.
Such an interesting point, because yesterday we were talking disability, and one of the people we were speaking with was Shani Danda, who has a condition which means she's only 3'10", and she was saying how that, you know, if children experience the space in a similar way to her, it's not very accessible. So it's really something that we probably haven't given enough thought to. But moving on then from that child experience into that tertiary level, and Charlie, you felt quite compelled to campaign around that experience of architectural education. Can you tell me a little bit about what the Future Architects Front has been about and what your campaigning has really been about?
Yeah, I mean, it's become fairly multifaceted, especially in recent months, but originally the campaign was focused at the experience of graduates moving from university education into practice, specifically looking at the way that the architectural assistant position is incorporated into the pathway to qualification, how much oversight there is for this role, you know, looking at things like the number of people who were staying in this supposedly educational role for years and years and years and sort of becoming professional architectural assistants in a way, which is quite counterintuitive. And yeah, generally we were sort of focused on trying to provide a bit of a structural analysis on why this is happening and organizing momentum around ways that we can exert pressure on practice and architectural governance to try and sort of resolve this bottleneck that we were observing.
Paul, in your role, sort of, you know, working in an architectural school, that journey through part 1, part 2, part 3, where this experience happens in between, you know, what would you expect that experience to be like?
Connected, I think, is a word that comes up. I think it's interesting. We started actually chronologically with Jenny there, and then Charlie talking about practice. And I think we just have to connect up from young people right through to people going in an office. And I don't think that's, I mean, it's a big challenge, but it certainly isn't impossible. Culturally, I think in the UK, we are just not very good at explaining the arts. I mean, as the father of 2 daughters, having been through infant, junior, secondary and so on schools, we all know that the humanities and the arts are just not taught. In state schools particularly, that you have to have private lessons for music, for example. So teaching them about space is an urban environment is an enormous challenge. We just don't we just don't value ourselves enough, I think, in terms of understanding the arts, understanding the profession, understanding what architecture could be. And I don't think we value ourselves. So I think we have to start right at the very beginning, through that journey, making connections with practice, the environment, and education. I mean, the worlds of practice and academia are far too far apart at the moment. We really have to make those connections such that that we're preparing young people for going into practice, knowing what the world is going to be.
So what should that look like then to you then, Paul?
Sorry, I missed that.
What does that connection look like for you?
Yeah, so in what way do you mean? In practice?
So you'll say, in reality, you know, we should be doing more to sort of make architecture, you know, more accessible at earlier stages in our working lives, and bring that into the secondary and tertiary education. So yeah, what does that connection look like? What should we be doing more?
Well, I think it's a really good point. I think action is the key word here. I think practice has to engage more with schools. Schools of architecture have to engage more with practice. That's the first thing I'd say. And likewise in schools in the area, I think as a responsibility for educators, we also have a responsibility to go into schools with younger people, pre-university, GCSEs, A-levels, secondary schools, pretty much as Jenny was saying there, and help young people to understand what the environment is and how they can influence things.
Jenny, you've just joined the RIBA, but you've been in architectural education for a while. You know, some of the things that Charlie has been raising and his other student colleagues around, you know, the issues that the Future Architects Front has raised. You know, how much have you seen already of this in your architecture education career?
I think, to be fair, I've seen all that Charlie's talking about, and I think anybody within education will have seen that. And we've seen bad practice, but we've also seen really good practice. And what we really need to be doing is looking at how we encourage that good practice for students. And I think what Paul is talking about in terms of connecting up all of those dots of the communication between schools, schools of architecture and practice is really, really important. I think one thing that I'm really interested in, and I'm sure we'll get onto it later, in terms of access to architecture and the profession, is that we talk about widening access. We talk about how we get some of those young people into architecture. Part of that is excitement and actually introducing what the subject actually is. And we need to be able to communicate what architecture is in a better way into those schools. And we need to ensure that careers advisors also understand what that is. Architecture is inherently difficult, and it is. There's no two bones about that. It combines the arts and the humanities and the sciences, and we're asking students who come in to actually be able to achieve in all of those things, and that's a hard ask. But what we're also asking of them is to become strategic thinkers and to be able to apply that strategic thinking in what we're doing. So that's asking a lot of those students coming into architecture. So within education, we need to be able to do all of that and encourage students in all of those ways.
But I guess your point, Charlie, is that you're going through all of this, you're incredibly bright and well, you know, multifaceted individuals. And then when you get into practice, you're maybe not valued in the way that you feel you should be.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of several different kind of issues all tied up into that process. There's, you know, the general business model of architecture in general is leaving a lot of practices sort of charging very low fees, and so that then gets passed down the line to the most junior employees in terms of unpaid overtime, low salaries, things like that. And, you know, then there's the way that education sort of ties into that, which I think is all to do with the way that we're defining architectural practice. I think that at the moment, we're a little too worried about sort of codifying a single meaning for the role of an architect and what architectural practice looks like. And I think the consequence of that is that we're all being channeled down a very narrow lane, which has very limited professional applicability. And, you know, one thing that I'm excited about is that more and more there appears to be groups who are sort of bucking this trend and developing their own niches within the profession. You know, look at Assemble have also gone down sort of like an art collective route. Forensic architecture are bringing in like forensic visual journalism into their architectural practice. So, you know, that for me is kind of the big picture about how we improve sort of what I see as, I suppose, the health of the profession as a whole, is to try and sort of move away from this very rigid, fairly conservative understanding of what an architect should be and do towards a more plural understanding that can sort of improve the value of the profession as a whole.
And certainly, and Jenny, the architectural education piece is where that all starts to sort of acknowledge all of that. So what sort of acknowledgement do you hope to bring now that you're, you know, doing this role? You know, it's quite a big question to ask you. You know, you and I have spent significant time together, haven't we, sort of talking about that more inclusive approach to education. So how is that approach going to try to feed into some of your thoughts as you move into the role?
I think that, you know, I suppose previously I talked about accessibility, but on the other side of that, we also need to think about the manageability of that and how we actually approach making that route through architectural education accessible. It needs to be manageable. And Charlie, I understand what you're saying in terms of the routes that we have into the profession. And I think that with architectural reform being such a current subject at the minute, it's something that we need to pursue over the coming couple of years, particularly as the ARB are looking at what an outcomes-based approach might mean in terms of acknowledging the competences of a student as they enter the profession, because we need to be able to do that. But I think in terms of making education manageable, we need to look at how we make that manageable for people from different perspectives, from different walks of life, and how we open it up to other people. We have apprenticeships, we have the RIBA studio, which has now been running for about 20 years, which is opening it up to people who perhaps have got stuck at part one and haven't been able, for whatever reason, to be able to make it through into part two. And so we have to understand what that is. But in a broader term, we have to recognise what architectural education is and how we actually respond to the pressures that are on students nowadays. We have to understand the fact that so many people are having to work in order to fund their way through education. And so these are a number of the things that I'm really hoping to start to push the door off as I come into this role.
We're talking architecture education with the Director of Education at the RIBA, Dr Jenny Russell, from the Future Architecture Front, Charlie Edmond, and Paul Crosby from the Architectural Association. Between 5 and 6 p.m, it's My Soundtrack, and today it's with Emre Turkman. London-based producer and songwriter began making music with an 8-track recorder and acoustic guitar in his home studio. Meanwhile, he was studying architecture and remembers spending many hours here at the library at Portland Place, So tune in later today to find out how he went from working in an architect's office to forming the band Years and Years. It's going to be absolutely brilliant later on. We're currently talking architecture education with the Director of Education here at the RIBA, Dr Jenny Russell, and from the Future Architects Front, Charlie Edmond, and Paul Crosby from the Architectural Association. He's the Director of Professional Practice there. And if we can talk about that point that you were making, Jenny, before we went to George Michael and Mary J. Blige, about accessibility, cost. It's very expensive to become an architect, isn't it?
It is expensive because it's long, and there are costs which are associated with studying architecture. There's paying for trips, there's paying for materials, and all other costs that are associated with being a student. So we know that. There are different ways of studying. There are normal public universities, there are private schools, and there are other ways in for example, the apprenticeship pathway in which students' fees are paid for them. So there's a range of different ways in which architecture can be studied, but we still need to do more to that. And we still need to look at how we can open up a profession and an education which is inherently expensive.
The Architectural Association is a very prestigious place to study architecture, but Paul, it is incredibly expensive to go to your school.
It is, yes. Or a little over twice the typical university fees in the UK. But let's not talk about a single school and the particularity. I think there's a general point here to be made about the cost of education, and Jenny quite rightly says it's a long education. I personally don't think it should be shortened, but therein lies the issue. And I'm in the privileged position of being an examiner on the Part 3 programs, which is the gateway to the profession. It's the leading to registration. So I run a course at the AA. In my time at the AA, I must have seen I counted the other day, about 500 students. I examine on other programs, and as part of that, I read a lot of career appraisals of students' reviews of their time in education. And I don't want to over exaggerate this, but at times it's harrowing. I think we really have to address education generally. On the subject of cost, I bring it back to a word I used earlier, which is value. And I really do believe that Part 1, the first 3 years of the degree, is a very good, all-embracing, as Jenny said earlier, humanities, the arts, the sciences. It provides a really good beginning for most young people to go into architecture or another career of their choosing. The issue for me is Part 2. And it is for most students, and I believe it's for the profession and employers, because it's, and to paraphrase, over 1,000 essays I must have read, more maybe, it's more of the same of Part 1. And I think going back to what Charlie was saying earlier as well, there are different ways of practicing. And I think we have to get away from the stereotypical, in inverted commas, traditional pathway into what a small to medium practice is, and think of architects and architecture and education in a different way. And think of it more in terms of research. You know, Part 2, the second 2 years, for those people listening who don't understand that, who don't know that, Part 2 is the postgraduate research. And in most subjects, the 2 years after the degree leads to specialization as opposed to generalization. And I think from my point of view, that's the area that I think we really do have to focus on. And then, as Charlie said earlier, you know, you study for 5 years, if not 6, you then go into a job where you might be on 25, 26, 27, 28,000 pounds a year. I mean, that has to be addressed.
How do you think this can be addressed then, Charlie? I mean, what do you think can be done differently around how that level of is paid?
Well, yeah, £25,000 if you're lucky. I think average starting salary for a Part 1 is closer to 21, so it's not great. I mean, I think the way that the accreditation is structured right now is, I think it has a very 20th century mindset where we're looking at a profession that used to have things like fixed fees, used to have a great deal of public work that it could rely on. And so maybe then in that context, a very sort of rigid, gate-kept understanding of architect and architecture was a way of preserving value, maybe. But now we don't have either of those. We don't have public work, apart from a very, very, very tiny percentage, and we don't have fixed fees. So from where I'm standing, the only sort of logical way to try and increase value is through, a more plural understanding of architecture, to provide more value through different types of work that we are sort of equally capable of producing, if we only allowed ourselves to sort of look beyond this traditional practice understanding of the profession. I think the ways that we achieve that are sort of from the bottom and from the top. So from the top, I think it looks like things like the ARB's reforms that are going on right now. But at the end of the day, there's only so much understanding that regulators, sort of bodies like this, there's only so much understanding they can get from their somewhat removed position. So that needs to be met by grassroots organizing, making these issues clear and communicating them effectively. And in an ideal world, it would also be met with a strong union presence in architecture as well, because then that doesn't give employers the opportunity to ignore the problem, because their entire workforce is telling them, no, you have to sort it out.
And certainly that point that you're all making about value is one that we are determined in our society to look at value through this lens of pounds and pence, rather than the value to our society, the value to our environment, the value of people. And that's a massive ideological shift in our whole, world, really, and certainly, in the UK, in the way that we view architecture. I mean, Jenny, just listening to Charlie's points there, it's expensive to train. Even if you're just going to a regular university, but that's at least $9,000 a year, you plus all the costs that you talked about. We're talking coming out with what, 60 grand's worth of debt sometimes?
Yeah, I'm probably sitting around 70 or 80 right now.
8, wow. And that's a massive burden, isn't it, to be taking? So the apprenticeship scheme, is there enough support in practice and government support, and indeed RIBA and ARB or whatever other support around, to help with those alternative paths into the profession? And then, speaking to Pooja's point earlier about inclusive recruitment, are those paths into the profession valued by practice?
From the information and from what I've seen so far, we are seeing more and more schools of architecture setting up apprenticeship pathways. So the opportunities seem to be there and seem to be out there. The support that is, and the financial support that's there in terms of the funding for undergraduate, for the Part 1 or the Level 6 apprenticeship pathways, has just been increased. So there are moves to encourage and to further this as a way of opening up education in architecture and as a pathway into the profession. So there is movement going on. It's an issue. We're aware that it's an issue. As the RIBA, we are doing some things as well as encouraging and pursuing the apprenticeship pathways, we run a number of bursary schemes for students. Within the last year, we have supported students probably to the tune of about £280,000, which is a huge amount. We know that many students are sitting in debt, but we are actively trying to pursue that to support students to the best of our ability as an education department and as an institution. We've also been implementing the Compact. Now, the Compact is an agreement between student, professional, the practice, and also the professional studies advisor, the School of Architecture, to have a series of agreements and commitments within that process in seeking out good practice. And we know that some of what Charlie has encouraged and pushed for is a part of that compact that has that's currently going through a trial process, and we are encouraged by what we're hearing from that. So we're actively trying to work with students, work with professional studies advisors and schools of architecture, and also the practice, to see good practice on all sides, from the schools, from the students, but also from the practices themselves.
Paul, in terms of, you're the director of professional practice, I suppose. What do you want to see from that triangulation of student and professional body and school?
No, it's a really good point. And coming back to something Jenny said there about the compact, at the AA, we have, with all of our students heading off to a year, I don't know why we call it a year out. It always worries me, that expression. I still use it, but I haven't found another term. Year, it's almost as though we're escaping from something into something, but let's call it the year in professional practice, year 3 and year 5. We have something similar at the AA and have had for a few years now. We have an agreement between the student, the practice, and the AA, whereby the practice engages in that process. They're not just young people heading into a practice to make the coffee, tidy the library, and then maybe occasionally do a rendering. And they might be even granted the possibility of attending a meeting. We want the student to be a continuation of that learning process, and for the practices to value the young person, engage them in the whole process of design. One thing I'd like to do, Marsha, I would like to ban the word internship. I mean, I think everybody at the AA knows me now. I use the word internship in my talks. I did with some year 3 students the other day. I had a little meeting with a group of them. They're already thinking about their year in practice in July next year from year 3. They were talking about which sort of internship should I go for. I'm saying, please do not even think about using that loaded term internship. Let's talk about this, about being a proper position. And I think that education has to become, quite literally, has to begin in the schools of architecture. So these young people will be going into the profession as a practice, and they will be practitioners very soon. And we have to stop thinking about it, academia being academia and practice being the so-called real world. I want there to be, it goes back to the word connection I mentioned earlier. I don't want it to be seen as we're in academia and then it's the real world of practice. I want the word profession to straddle both. And I think that's where we have to begin in terms of educating ourselves as well as young people and then the professionals.
Charlie, let's talk about actions and what we want to see done. This is a great opportunity to really say to practice and to say to architecture in the built environment, this is what you need to do. This is what those who've signed up to the Future Architects Front and supporting your work want to see. What would you like to say to them?
Well, I think something that we're seeing again and again from, these older, slightly fading issues of like unpaid internships, fading at least in the UK, to current issues of unpaid overtime, overwork, is that at the end of the day, the place that architectural assistants work, as much as we may like to dress what we do up as studio, atelier, collective, etc., they are businesses. And a business, at the end of the day, is an organization which exists to generate profit. So I think there's always going to be a limit in terms of these conversations around how can we convince business to not center profit in their decision-making process. So for me, it's not so much about convincing practice directors or convincing partners to act in a more philanthropic way. I think that's it's coming at it from the wrong angle. I think the way to address it is to build power in employees, graduates, and sort of force that change that we want to see. So this is why, we work so closely with the Architecture Union, UVW SAW. This is why we're always interested in getting into universities and talking about the actual economic conditions under which architecture is produced and which sort of capital flows through the profession. We'd love to do a talk at the AA about that, by the way. But yeah, it's for us, it's not so much about this top-down approach. It's more about building solidarity and power at the bottom and making that change unavoidable.
Paul, you want to respond to that?
No, I just want to say to Charlie, we have had UVW and SAW came in to speak on the Part 3 programme just a few months ago on September, and it was very well received. I mean, I think the problem, I suppose, is coming into the AA, and on the Part 3 professional practice programme, you're pushing at an open door. And I think the audience maybe is the practitioners more than us as young. I was almost including myself as a young person there. Than
Sorry,
we.
I didn't mean to scoff.
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much.
But Paul, just on that point of power, I suppose, and giving that to, do you feel that the culture within architecture education is the right culture to be sharing then with the rest of the profession? Is that growing in the right way?
Oh my goodness, there's a big subject. I think the seeds of cultural behaviour, Marsha, are sown in the schools of architecture from day one. I mean, I think, we at the AA, we're a single subject school, but having taught at universities and studied at universities where you're part of a campus and you see other students, I think it's a generalization, but I'll say it anyway, that most students on other courses always slightly feel sorry and concerned for the architecture students because we're the ones who look exhausted because we're doing so many hours. And the pressure, and I don't want to overstate it, but pressure, stress, mental health in architecture students is an ever developing subject, and one that demands further investigation and research and an understanding of what it means. And I think we have to address these all-nighters that becomes de rigueur. It becomes almost standard practice to work for 48 hours to prove how good you are. I mean, that it surely has to be about quality, not quantity of hours, to produce more and more work. So the seeds of what Charlie was talking about there of overtime, unpaid work, I mean, not so much in university, of course, but that quantity of hours is sown. That culture of bad behaviour, let's say, is sown in the School of Architecture. And I think we have to get away from the final production and make it more about process, not about I have to be up 48 hours to produce a final rendering.
Yeah, and certainly it wasn't by chance I played Night Shift by the Commodores earlier. I mean, Jenny, this is definitely an area that needs to be addressed. We spoke with Claire Nash a couple of days ago about making that different kind of culture. I mean, how does even the RIBA lead that kind of different culture creation?
So, Paul, I entirely agree. And I've just published through the RIBA 2 guides on really that look into mental well-being among students and early career architects. It was led by Alan Jones, who invited me to work on that with him, and I worked with writer Matt Thompson on producing these guides, which are very short, but they address very forthrightly the issues of mental health and well-being. And I'm aware that it is from the schools of architecture where these seeds are sown, but I'm also aware that it's not necessarily always from the academics and from the teachers and tutors. And in fact, in a number of schools that I've been in, I've seen tutors actively trying to encourage students not to engage in this practice. But we're seeing that this badge of honour of doing all-nighters is being passed down from student to student. Now, don't get me wrong, there is bad practice being pushed on students to work harder and harder in institutions. So I'm not saying that it's not there, but I'm aware that there is an ingrained understanding that as an architecture student, you have to work all the time, which then is feeding into practice. I'm very aware that we need to encourage and teach students to understand how to develop their skills to work better as opposed to work longer. And we need to work hard at this to ensure that students understand that that's really important and that maintaining good mental well-being is critical.
There's so much more to say and talk about here. Like I say, we'd barely scratched the surface, but by starting the conversation, we can really give air and light to the issues that we must tackle. We've been talking architecture education with the Director of Education here at the RIBA, Dr Jenny Russell, from the Future Architects Front, Charlie Edmond, and Paul Crosby, the Architectural Association's Director of Professional Practice. We'll be speaking to Sue Ems, Grace Troy and Elena Marco. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop here at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. With me, Marsha Ramroop, I'm the Director of Inclusion here. We're 18 hours down. And only 10 hours to go, bringing you 28 hours of material to help build inclusion into everything. They've gone wild now. They've gone wild, the team here. We're doing everything. It's all based in CQ, cultural intelligence. We've been talking inclusive recruitment. We've been talking architectural education. Now we're going to start talking about working outside London. We're talking CQ strategy, planning, checking awareness. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place. You can hear the ambience, you can hear people wandering around the bookshop, you can hear reception at the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects. We're broadcasting with me. I'm Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. And everything we're speaking about on RIBA Radio is rooted in this behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. And CQ, cultural intelligence, is a measure as well as a skill. And it's the capability to work and relate effectively with those from different backgrounds of you. So it asks, what is it about me? What is it about my organisation? What is it about my practice that needs to change so I can be better and more inclusive and effective at working with you? So far we've given you that overview of CQ. We've talked about unconscious bias, we've talked about inclusion in architecture, we've spoken about the first two capabilities within CQ because there are four of them. So CQ drive, how much do you want to work with those who are different from you? What are your motivations? What can you work on, especially when it gets tough? And CQ knowledge, which is about what do you know, what are you thinking about regarding others? And we spoke about some lived experiences. So we've spoken about women, we've spoken about race, disability, LGBTQ+ lives, socioeconomic disadvantage as well. Today is the first of our 2 days talking CQ strategy. So we've been talking about thinking about what you're thinking about. So it's about planning interactions, checking your assumptions, self-awareness. It's about creating procedural changes to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. So we've already discussed inclusive recruitment and architecture education, but you know, that's a big, deep subject. So we kind of only just scratched the surface there. But now we're going to discuss the assumptions that are made about the sector outside of London. So we've got as well, coming up between 5 and 6 every day, my soundtrack. Oh, you know, when he was in my office recording, I didn't really clock who he was. And if I'd paid attention to the fact that he was produced Years and Years, I probably would have gone all fangirly, to be honest, because I totally rate Years and Years. I think Ollie Alexander is the most exceptional performer, hugely talented. And talking of exceptional talent, as we speak about some of the assumptions that are made about architects and the sector outside of London, I'm joined by Grace Choi, Sue Ems and Elena Marco. And if I could start by asking you, could you briefly tell us about yourself, where you're based, and what drew you to that part of the UK? If I can start with you, Sue. So tell us a bit about yourself, where you're based, and what drew you to that part of the UK.
Hi, Marsha, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for being inviting me to be part of this panel. It's great to be part of the conversation. So I'm Sue Ems. I suppose if I describe me professionally, I'm an architect director at BDP, and I have responsibility for our North regions. I'm based in Manchester. I'm a northerner. I'm born and bred. I was educated in the north as well. And I lead our northern studios, which is Manchester, Sheffield, Birmingham, Liverpool and Leeds. I guess I was drawn here. I was born here. I've had a small time, a number of years in London after I graduated, but I came back to my roots. I was drawn, I guess, to the north because I'm passionate about the culture, the people, and making a difference in places that I live, working with the communities I live within. So I guess that's what drew me back to Manchester, to be part of, I guess, the Northern Powerhouse.
Speaking of Northern Powerhouse, Grace, could you tell us a bit about yourself, where you're based and what drew you to that part of the UK?
Sure, yep. So hi everyone, I'm Grace Choi and I am of South Korean descent, and I run a small value-led practice called Grace Choi Architecture in the Northeast, so Newcastle based. I also lead the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion group for the RIBA in the Northeast, which is called Change the Record. And we do a lot of sort of conversational interaction on Zoom via something that we call the Jedi Talks, just equality, diversity and inclusion. I accidentally ended up in the Northeast, to be honest, and I've made it my home since 2013. Before then, I worked in London, Glasgow, and I'm actually a Manc at heart. So Sue, you know, my heart is very much also in Manchester. I'm a Northern lass by attitude and accent, as you might tell. But yeah, life, family, work led me to the Northeast, and I can genuinely say that it has been the best place for me to land. It's been so welcoming, actually really inclusive, and is a brilliant place to practice architecture.
Thank you. And Elena, the same to you, a bit about yourself, where you're based and what drew you to that part of the UK.
So as you will see from my accent, I am not from the UK. I'm a Spaniard that came to the UK 21 years ago and actually was given a fantastic opportunity to work with Field and Craig Bradley Studios. Peter Clegg could not understand what I was talking about because I could not speak kind of very well English, but he still kind of gave me one of the most incredible opportunities and allowed me to stay in the UK. And then what happened, all these northerners like Grace and Sue made you stay because I ended up kind of having half married to a Yorkshire man, but my accent has not changed. And I'm currently the head of department for architecture and the built environment, kind of all the professions of the construction industry at the University of the West of England.
Thank you so much. Now, London centricity. It's something I've repeatedly heard about the profession since I began in it, and geographical diversity, clearly something that needs to be addressed. But in your opinion, if I can start with you, Sue, why is London centricity a concern?
Okay, thank you. I mean, London is a global city, isn't it? It's our financial heart. It has some of the best universities and the best research in architecture. I think 1 in 4 architects practice in London. So the profession is very London centric. But I think the perception of it is stronger than maybe about the demographic. A lot of activity has focused around London. I think obviously the RIBA headquarters in London and many practice headquarters are also in London. albeit BDP's headquarters is in Manchester, I have to say. So there is definitely a trend. I remember when I was graduated, there was this mass migration to London, to the bright lights of London, because the opportunities were greater, I think. There was obviously a lot of elite, very good design-led practices, and people just felt that they wanted to get a part of that, and that was really critical to their career progression. I think the trend is slightly changing though, and I think that's quite important to recognise. Why is it a problem? I think it's a problem because a lot of the issues about being London-centric means that actually, do we represent the societies and the communities that we design for? And I'm not suggesting London isn't diverse, because it is very diverse. But as architects, we have to work nationally and globally. And it's really important, therefore, that we are seen as a profession that is embedded into our cities and our communities that we work within. And that inequality from a geographic point of view is evened out. And I think, you've probably discussed this in the education sector, but obviously the affordability around the profession and the cost of living in London, I think, is definitely changing people's perceptions. We're seeing graduates now who are concerned about student debt, who want to live in more affordable cities where opportunities are as good, but they can repay back the cost of education for 5 years. So we are seeing a trend, and I think that opens up huge doors around social mobility and diversifying the profession in all regions, not just London.
Grace, so I saw you nodding away there with some of what Sue was saying. Is, from your perspective, is there enough sort of kudos, if you like, for want of a better word, given to those practices and what happens outside of London?
No, absolutely not. I think there are some brilliant practices, individuals, and much diversity, found outside of London. And I mean, I think the first thing I would challenge is our language that we've even used to describe this. Being outside London is exclusive in itself, because it makes us sound secondary and less important and not part of the hub. And actually, there are leading practices, leading individuals, leading initiatives, radicals, brilliant experimental work coming from very different places that have to be specific to the region, that are a result of those communities and are diverse places to sort of live and work with. And we need to celebrate that a lot more. I mean, if we take the Northeast as an example to start with, if we actually look at the social demographic in terms of the makeup of society outside of architecture, it does, in terms of diversity, in terms of data, come across as quite poor. I think the sort of percentage of white British people in the Northeast is actually about 94%. So it's extremely high, which is a challenging starting point. And we know architecture has a significant issue when it comes to sort of diversity of sort of different ethnicities, especially in the Northeast. So the more we champion London, the more we champion people moving away from our regions to want to go towards London as hubs. We sort of sacrifice something in the regions because that's becoming the attraction, when actually there's brilliant stuff happening out here, including our sort of Jedi talks and the stuff we're doing regionally out here in the Northeast. There are all sorts of sort of agencies and initiatives that are brilliant. And I think especially now that we have this ability to, to communicate digitally and online, we need to let diversity be led from places other than where we think is, other than London, really.
Elena, you're leading a department in a place outside of London, which is Bath, Bristol area. Can you describe what your experience is of, that sense of leading an architecture school outside? Because London does have this pull. When I looked at the statistics of the where the money's coming from in the profession, it's all London based. And so, you know, a lot of the architecture schools and some of the, again, kudos, a bit of snobbery, if you like, about London architecture schools. You know, how do you cope and react to some of that?
It's not about coping. I think it's just about being, can you hear me properly? Yeah?
Yep, loud.
It's not about coping. It's about just being confident on what you do. So, you know, some people tells me the best things are in London. Are they really? And I just kind of, I don't want to be like them. If some of the behaviors I see in some of the schools of architecture in London, I'm actually not interested. And I don't champion that in my school. And I have got now a staff that chooses to be with us instead of wanting to be in London, because we are doing something different. Our students come all across the UK and outside London, and it is about having the diversity and the culture of many countries in what you provide that gives them a richness to choose you, not to just decide London or not London. I will tell you, if I was a student trying to choose for a London school, there is a lot of schools in London I will never choose.
Well, I'm speaking to architects Grace Choi, Sue Ems, Elena Marco about architecture. Coming up in the next hour, we're taking a deep dive, talking about planning for the menopause in the workplace. We'll be joined by Sally Leach of Henpicked, which is a menopause support consultancy. And earlier we were talking about inclusive recruitment with Dr Susy Ridout of Oxford Brookes, Pooja Agrawal of Public Practice and Dr Binna Kandola of Pearn Kandola. It was a very useful, very practical discussion about some of the things that can be done. And ultimately, you're going to have to put in more time, more effort, more resources into your processes if you want to hire diversity of staff and ensure you have an inclusive culture. And so it's definitely worth a listen back. And this will be repeated on the listen link that you're listening in now as we come off the live broadcast. I'm speaking to architects Grace Choi, Sue Ems and Elena Marco about architecture outside of London. And if I can start by coming back to you, Sue, about, you know, the economics of the profession, if you like, and procurement and so on. It seems like all the big practices, all the big projects, if you like, are London based. So how do we push that out into the rest of the country so there can be more equity and equality in how the rest of the country gets involved in these things?
Okay, I think you're quite right. I mean, we have 6 UK studios. Our biggest studio is London. And as a northerner sort of looking in at their opportunities, I get very jealous. They're big, they've got big scale, you know, ambitious design aspirations, great projects, you know, large fees as well. You know, and I think in the north, projects are a lot more scarce. And I think also maybe they're a little bit harder to win. We do have London practices, obviously winning work in the north as well. I guess as a result, maybe our approach to winning work in the north is a little bit more entrepreneurial. We have to be a bit more agile. We have to be a bit more efficient around how we deliver projects, etc. So, and those are skills I think are very critical to our profession anyway. How do we change that? So I think obviously devolution is really critical. I think if you just look at the city of Manchester under Sir Howard's leadership and Andy Burnham, you know, Manchester has thrived because of devolution, where we have controlled where we spend the local money. And we put it into those projects that matter to our communities. And I think with greater devolution, we'll see a lot more control about economics. I think it's really important that those big projects, I mean, obviously we saw the announcement last week on the infrastructure projects, HS2, HS3, and the impact that has had on the north. But I think it's really important that large, especially government-led public procured projects make sure that they benefit not just London, but the rest of the UK. On some of our large-scale jobs, we work very collaboratively across our studios to make sure that we can spread the love. The pipeline of work from London is probably about 25% of some of our northern studios workload, and I think that's really important, that big infrastructure public projects that actually they benefit the rest of the country, and the spend doesn't just stay within London. I think I probably sort of reached that sort of conclusion, and as I say, I think the opportunities in the north are slightly less, and we have to be a bit more entrepreneurial and agile about our approach to work winning in the north.
Procurement and clients as well. Is there something that we should be encouraging our clients to think about when it comes to, you know, who are they turning to when it comes to, you know, the spend and who they're choosing as their architects, Grace?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I would just take a backward step really to the question initially that you raised, you know, in terms of economics, where are the opportunities outside of London? Because I think that statement in itself leads us making decisions based on financial value. And I would probably, you know, we do a lot of work in the community in our practice, and there's often the challenge that economics, you know, a capitalist mindset, profit, growth, bigger, better, can result in having an expense on the people, on community. There's a human cost to being led in a singular focused way. So it's for me, it's really.
Oh, we've lost Grace there.
Finding that balance in people first, which is the heart of inclusion, isn't it? And it's putting a spin on a statement of growth and opportunity to actually put those communities and people first in that conversation. You know, as a smaller practice, we're more agile to sort of to bring these questions up with our clients and with the people we work with. So just, you know, as an example, you know, we work with the Bangladeshi community in West Newcastle. And, you know, my bigger question was, where are all the architects who are present, who have that proximity, who these communities can work with? Just not there. You know, we work with sort of communities in North Shields, which is a really place of social deprivation. And I think, you know, if you're led by economics, you're not going to go to those places because they're really hard, economically frustrating, and you know, there's a whole different dynamic that I think we have to fundamentally question our value system and make that a positive spin come out of this, so that the people are leading the economics and the heart of inclusion is leading a better way that we're designing with communities.
Elena, so you had a bit of a wry smile as you're listening to Grace there. I mean, what are your thoughts on some things that Sue and Grace are saying?
So for me, I will put it in the context of what Grace and Sue are saying from the point of view of what a school of architecture and built environment can do. For me, it's about, you know, educating the ethically driven, diverse leaders of tomorrow that have got a different mindset, that is not economic, values over things above that. You know, yes, the economics need to work in the background, but they are not the commercial drive. And this is one of the things I significantly have made a massive change in my department over the last 6 years, when we had curriculum but was really focused about commercial focus. And I say, actually, it's not that. You are educating people to change the world and have the principles, the ethics, and the values that will make sure that that happens. And I hope I'm kind of providing that to the profession. That is my aim, because I think if I can put a little grain, that will help Grace and Sue in everything that they do.
You go for it, Eleanor. That's great.
I'll try.
No, well, certainly, you know, but more than that, I suppose, though, let's, you know, Elena, that you've got these students going through architectural practice. One of the things we were just talking about was the cost of architectural education. And are these students coming out into practice thinking about where is the next pound going to come from, because I've got 90 grand's worth of debt and so I have to push up my fees. I have to look at where the profit is here for me. Isn't that, fundamentally a problem?
I think you have to look at it in the context of where do you want to go next? Education costs not just to architects, costs to everyone, and how has it been established in this country? I can influence government, if that makes any sense, but the complexities of the way the fee structure are happening in this country is just not kind of saying I start paying this amount of money and then I come out at the end kind of with that debt. It's much more complex than that, because there are different opportunities, and you go and see, people that doesn't pay Part 1 graduates, or people that there are other elements that are contributing.
We've got a pause on Elena as well. I mean, see, you also work in education and might have a view on that.
Yeah, I'm a visiting practice professor at Sheffield and also been an external examiner at Manchester School of Architecture for the past 5 years. And I think Elena's right. Money doesn't drive every student to make...
About the...
Yes, sorry. So I think students are very ethical. They're quite socially motivated. Their salaries are important to them, but the ethics of the practice and what we stand for and our values are just as important. And I think that's is becoming more increasingly, when we hold interviews with students, they ask us more questions about us and our values and our sustainability and our social value and how we support local communities. It is part of students questioning interviews now. So it clearly is higher on the agenda. We work with a lot of students and to do sort of social value. We work with a lot of schools and outreach. And some of our projects tie social value to offering employment opportunities for underrepresented groups in architecture, etc. And that's, to me, where you can make the real difference. We also have KPIs on projects about local spend as well. So making sure to spend the money, the pound stays within city regions. And I think those are where procurement can be quite clever to really drive sort of outcomes for both social value and to me, social value and diversity come hand in hand, because the social economic background is really important to diversify the profession and allow access to the profession for people that might not go down a traditional pathway.
Grace, do you have a request, if you like, to the profession around sort of making the profession more equitable when it comes to, geographical diversity?
Yeah, absolutely. I get a lot of practices just getting in contact to say how do we become more diverse, and it is an issue, especially in places where, we've just heard from Elena before about the rich diversity of our universities. We have strong representation of students that are often much more enlightened when it comes to social ethics, economical ethics and values, and also have a better sort of representation across the board in terms of the sort of architects we need in our practices, and often actually capturing those students and having them stay in the regions where maybe representation is poorer is an issue. I think one solution is, for practices to actually get in there alongside, we need to be much more integrated with our universities and places of education, so that transfer is more seamless. It's not a massive step of suddenly seeing a practice that's full of white men and thinking I don't want to go and work there. It's actually sort of addressing it early on. Yeah, I think absolutely we need to all work much harder, especially those practices where we know we have really poor representation.
I'm speaking to architects Grace Choi, Sue Ems and Elena Marco about architecture outside of London. Coming up, we'll be spending a good hour talking about planning for the menopause in the workplace. We've got a menopause consultancy henpicked on, and we'll be talking everything from definitions to symptoms to support, guidance, policy, and reasonable expectations someone can have of their workplace, no matter the size. And earlier we were talking about architectural education with the Director of Education here at the RIBA and with the Future Architects Front, the student campaign group, and the AA, one of the architecture schools. And if you missed that, what was very much a surface scratch of the issues, then do keep listening. We'll be repeating all our content as well as making it available online on the RIBA's YouTube channel. I'm currently speaking to architects Grace Choi, Sue Ems and Elena Marco about architecture outside of London. And if I can ask you, Grace, about, what are the kind of things that you want to see from the profession, from your senior members, from, the hub, if you like. We mentioned that, I'm broadcasting here from the HQ of the RIBA here in 66 Portland Place, central London, Fitzrovia, dare say. And, what do you want to see? What needs to happen to get that geographical diversity of the profession sort of more equitable?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've learned is that it's really valuable to listen to all voices, no matter sort of what level of the profession, from, students, part 1, 2, 3, right up to the top senior levels or the key figureheads that are leading our institutions. And we need to hear all those voices. But I think the voices that I'd like to hear more of, that have more power and more prominence, are those leading figureheads to champion and to promote and to welcome everyone, and also to put that emphasis on that it is not just about London, it is about UK and wider still. We don't just want to learn from our Western culture, we need to really embrace so much more. So it's about, firstly, having that visibility and that communication that is clear and without doubt that everyone is welcome. But it's also about absolutely listening and being transparent about that listening, about acknowledging where our faults are, that we don't all have it right. But hearing that from the top, I think, is really important, because it then disarms people to be so defensive in their response, and it opens up more possibilities. And I think also storytelling more about the success and the brilliant champions that we have across the country. It needs to be so much more prominent in our architectural sort of literature and storytelling and value system that we're feeding.
So visibility of that geographical diversity as well.
Absolutely.
Sue, what are your thoughts on that?
I think data is key, and I think as a profession we struggle to benchmark ourselves because we don't have the right data. We're doing a big project at the moment just looking at our demographic and what data we should capture, because actually we don't know how diverse we are and we can't measure progress. But if the RIBA and ARB can support us in data sliced by regions, that would be really, really helpful. For me, and I know we're going back onto architectural education, but a key one is level 6 apprenticeships. We were part of the Trailblazer group. I'm so disappointed in the North that we don't have a provider for level 6. We do in London, but not in the North. I know some institutions are about to launch them, but if we are to widen the talent pool, we've got to offer pathways into the profession that hit those demographics of people that are not going down that current traditional route. And I've seen firsthand what engineering apprenticeships do and the benefits they bring to us as a practice, the benefits they bring to the profession, the benefits they bring to diversity and social mobility. And somehow the architectural apprenticeships is just not quite delivering yet. And I guess ARB and RIBA getting behind those new pathways, especially, a lot of the Russell Group universities are AAA students. They're fantastic students, they're super intelligent, but they're all of the same mold. And actually, I want students that come from a different background with a different voice. I want students who had a different starting point and have still got their potential to hit. And some of the Russell Group or even our strong schools of architecture don't really open the doors to anybody without high attainment level. And apprenticeships and other pathways are critical to that. So the RIBA and the RIBA really supporting new pathways into the profession, I think is really, really important.
I'm sure, Elena, you have something to say about that sort of educational attainment piece.
I agree with you. It's apprenticeships is for both to transform the industry diversity, but also the educational diversity of how to do things. And it's kind of absolutely critical, but it's also having more voices within the people recruiting in industry to make sure the choices are not of the same mold, but different, and engaging with the universities in transforming those molds. So I will be delighted to work with people like Grace and Sue to make that change, because that is what I'm fighting for. And the other one is opportunities to access university that some people I've discovered when I was looking at a wording gap and the attainment gap of our students is confidence. Confidence is one of the biggest elements that stops people to think they can do it. And having universities that help those students to build that confidence is what I have seen transforming their lives in what I do. So for me, I woke up everybody, not trying to transform or change kind of lives without thinking about building the future of the confidence in the profession.
Sue, that point you were making about, there's hopefully soon a university in the north, I don't know how many, that are looking at the apprenticeship scheme. That's quite a big barrier. And especially when you think about the north-south divide and this perception of economic disadvantage more likely in the north. Actually, it's not just a perception. I think there's a reality there as well. It's really important, actually, for a breadth of universities across the country to be offering more apprenticeships, right?
Definitely. And I think level 7 is easy. The funding works. Students have done 3 years of architecture school. There's little risk, but it's not going to be transformational to the profession. But level 6, getting 18-year-old out of schools and colleges straight into the profession is really important. I hope I have got my facts right, and apologies if I haven't, but I don't. Certainly supporting our Manchester and Sheffield studios, we are struggling with the provider at the moment, albeit we collaborate with all the universities and supporting them in sort of getting their pathway moving. There has been a funding gap associated with level 6, and I understand that's been resolved now, and hopefully that will be a spark. There are some universities that offer different collaborative courses, part-time courses, but generally at master's level and nothing at undergraduate level. But I like Elena's point, actually. So institutions do have a part to play, but actually as a practitioner in terms of how we recruit people is just as important as well. And bias comes into it because we all have favourite schools of architecture, and we bring that bias into our recruitment process. And you've been talking about inclusive recruitment and how we train people to think differently, and having diverse opinions as part of that recruitment process is key. And understanding starting points, it's not where they've reached, it's where they've come from and the journey that has taken them there. Getting people to understand that and not defaulting to their favourite school of architecture that only promotes a particular type of student. We need to widen. I'm not saying one size fits all, but we've just got to promote as many pathways as possible into the profession.
Go Elena.
Can I say to Sue, and also the role models that Grace was talking about, that showcasing the role models to show the kind of those, inspire those students to say, I can do it, becomes absolutely as important as the recruitment, because it's all very nice to talk about the kind of the inclusivity and diversity, but if you don't have the role models that you say, I will go to this university or this practice and I will be understood, because so important. And actually without diversity, you can't do that. So for me, I've been recruiting like a mad lady, like, I've got 34 countries. I have got 20% Black, Asian, minority ethnics, 40% of females. And that then my students can see role models that they love about, and they can see they can do it.
Yeah,
that's really important.
When it comes to role models, it's giving those role models the confidence
to profile themselves, because you know, I often find there is representation in practices, but because, you know, many people might have, you know, it's been very difficult for them to get there, and you know, people struggle with their own confidence and their own imposter syndrome, and often if you're from a different ethnicity, you know, my culture is very submissive and very quiet, and I'm quite rare because I'm bolshy and loud and say what I think. But, you know, in order to encourage other people to have the confidence to put themselves up there and be visible at all different levels of practice, actually take someone else to come alongside them as well and say, look, I think you need to, you know, be a bit more present and let me support you. So it's actually coming alongside people to do that, and not just expecting everyone to be like us and to be quite vocal.
Can I say something, Marsha? It's like inspirational mentorship alongside that visibility of all is critical.
Yeah, it's quite funny because as a woman in the industry, as a junior architect, I hated to be a role model because I didn't want to be the best woman architect. I wanted to be the best architect. But in a leadership position, that power of being a role model, that power of mentorship, that power of just giving people a platform to have a voice is huge, and we don't have enough of it. And you know, I think, you know, the RIBA, yeah, I know you have your role model scheme, but just making sure that we really do build on that, because as Grace says, people sometimes don't have the confidence to speak out or to say that, you know, what barriers exist in their lives, and just empowering them to do that, giving them a platform, giving them a safe space to have that conversation is so powerful. We've started to develop a thing called Toolbox Talks within BDP. And these are volunteers who say, well, I'd like to talk about neurodiversity, but I haven't got the confidence. So we pair them up with people and we create the right safe space to do it. And the power of having that conversation and people being engaged in that conversation has been huge. And I think, you know, as a leader, for me, it's about giving people that opportunity and supporting them to do that. So yeah, really well made points there, Eleanor, about role models, and Grace about confidence and allowing them to do it.
Well, thank you very much indeed to architects Grace Choi, Sue Ems and Elena Marco, talking about not only architecture outside London, but what's required of those in practice as well.
This is live radio, folks, live radio. So tomorrow we have another day on CQ strategy. It's going to be humdinger because we're talking decolonisation. Not only do we have Dr. Neil Shasor, who is basically, I think, the authority on decolonisation, especially of the RIBA, but we're going to have Dr. Corinne Fowler. Now, she is the person who's behind all the national trust work around decolonisation, and we're going to have Decolonise Architecture, 6 Portland Place, where, you know, you can get your Christmas presents. Basically, if you don't know what to do, you don't know what to get, not only are there some amazing presents, but there are some great cards and things. Let's come over here in the corner where we've got Christmas cards. And we've got the great staff here. We've got the camera on us as well. Wave of the staff here at the bookshop. Great cards, great gifts. Can I actually go into a reception, do you think? Let's see if I can go. I'm going to give the tech team a bit of a heart attack as I walk out into the main reception. I just want to say a quick hi to the reception team. Say hi. You're live on the radio. As we walk through, and you can hear the echo around, and it's just great to be able to come into this building and you can feel the history, and you can feel a lot of, you know, everything that they're trying to achieve to create an inclusive society, because I've always said one of the reasons why I came for this role is because by creating inclusive spaces that we can influence the creation of inclusive society. So everything that we're trying to do here at the RIBA with RIBA RIBA Radio is all about trying to help you to help us to do that as well. But the bookshop itself's got some amazing, like this here, small little book, great for the stocking, the pocket complete colour harmony, 1,500 plus colour palettes for designers. I think it's just great. It's small, can fit in the pocket, literally. and is worth a purchase, amongst other things. You can tell I'm not on the BBC. All of these advertising that's going on. I'm going to come and sit down now.
Broadcasting your inclusion journey online, 18th to the 26th of November. You're listening to RIBA Radio.
Regroup! You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion at the RIBA, and I'm just asking the question, how did we get here? How did we get here? Because we're more than halfway through. We're 19 hours down, only 9 hours to go. Is that right? Have I got that right? I feel like, I'm counting my life away here a little bit. We're bringing you 28 hours of material to help you build inclusion into everything you do. It's all rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence. We've been talking inclusive recruitment. We've been talking architectural education. We've been talking about working outside London. And now we're talking the menopause. We're talking CQ strategy, planning, checking and awareness. You are listening to RIBA Radio, broadcasting live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place, the HQ of the Royal Institute of British Architects, with me, Marsha Ramroop. I'm the Director of Inclusion here. Everything we're speaking about on RIBA Radio is rooted in the behavioural principle of CQ, cultural intelligence, the capability to work and relate effectively with those who are different from you. So far, we have given you an overview of CQ. We have told you about unconscious bias. We've talked about the inclusion context within architecture. And we've spoken about the first 2 of 4 capabilities that it means that you need to be high in cultural intelligence. The first is CQ drive, which is how much do you want to work with others? What are you thinking about? What about your motivations? And CQ knowledge, what do you know? What are you thinking about regarding others? Coming up today, we have got more about CQ strategy, which is thinking about what you're thinking about. So planning interactions, checking your assumptions, self-awareness. It's about creating procedural changes to mitigate the impact of hidden bias. We've already talked about inclusive recruitment, and we have got coming up the menopause. You are listening to RIBA Radio, real, inclusive, brilliant action. Talking the menopause now with Sally Leach of Henpicked. It's important that organisations and managers know how to provide support for employees who are on their journey through the menopause. Raising awareness on this topic and reducing stigma attached to it really is vital so that open discussions can take place and inform the development of effective guidance and resources. According to the CIPD, women over 50, i.e. the majority of individuals who experience the menopause, are the fastest growing demographic within the UK's workforce. 59% of working women aged between 45 to 55 say the menopause has had a negative impact on them at work, impacting both attendance and performance. It's clear this isn't just an individual issue, it's an organisational one. And it's also clear that this age group is off-ramping from the architecture profession. So we need to ask if the menopause is a factor there, as the average age of women RIBA chartered architects is 44. So it's been really important that we develop our guidance here at the RIBA, which we have done, and we started by doing that by listening and learning from individuals. But Sally, let's go back to some basics and ask, what is the menopause?
Okay, and a really, really great place to start. And thank you very much for having me here today. Menopause itself is actually, clinically, it's a one-day event. So once a woman has a period for 12 months, she's said to have reached menopause. But anyone that's going through this, anyone that's supporting anyone through this, we know that doesn't tell the whole story. So there's a period of time in the run-up to menopause called perimenopause, which is around the time of menopause. And this is where hormones start to fluctuate and change and symptoms could be experienced. As Marsha was saying, that the average age of reaching that menopause date is 51. But perimenopause often is said to last around 5 to 7 years as an average. And so it's very, very normal for somebody to be experiencing menopause symptoms in their 40s. And even this can be impacting people much earlier, as some do go through a much earlier menopause as a premature menopause before the age of 40. And then once somebody's reached menopause the following day, they're considered to be postmenopausal. But it's fine when we talk about menopause to use that umbrella term, but the recognition of the phases somebody could be going through.
And, you know, I was speaking a little bit earlier about this horrendous thing that, so, you know, I've been really open. It's been all over the architectural press that I'm menopausal, perimenopausal, had various symptoms for about, at least 6 years now, from incredible lightheadedness, like dizziness, you know, debilitating, where, you know, I'd have to lie down basically for a day, to this incident that happened to me on the train where I thought I was having a heart attack. But there is no one list of symptoms. I mean, we talk about hot flushes. Everyone knows about hot flushes and, you know, brain fog. But there's just an endless list, isn't there?
Yes, and we often get asked, well, how many symptoms are there? And there are lots of people quoting specific numbers, but it's all about how does it impact on an individual, and the recognition and appreciation we need to have that this can be a very, very different journey. 1 in 4 actually go through menopause without experiencing any symptoms at all. Now, they're incredibly fortunate, but it means we should never be assuming just because we think someone's a menopausal age, they are experiencing symptoms, they do need help and support. But it means 3 in 4 do experience symptoms and 1 in 4 serious symptoms. And as you say, there are so many different ways this can be affecting both physically. So the most commonly spoken about, and again, another assumption is that menopause will be all about hot flushes. And for some, it can be a really debilitating part of the menopause journey, but not for everybody. And then those psychological symptoms, the anxiety, the loss of confidence, those we see really having a big impact, in particular at work. And in particular, if you think around that average age where menopause is coming, this is often quite a critical point in somebody's career, often in senior roles, and a huge wealth of experience. And then at a time when you're then, as you say, hit by those really challenging symptoms like that brain fog, or needing to go and lie down in a dark room, that actually that can be really hard to deal when you're in those in senior roles and trying to manage your way through work while you're experiencing those symptoms. So it's really important we never assume that anyone is going to be experiencing one way. And the other challenge that can be is because the symptoms can be very varied, and also, as you say, things like heart palpitations, how do we know that's menopause? How do we know it's not something else? That actually many people arrive at this time just not realizing that menopause is actually what's going on. There is an assumption that we have an education around menopause, and that of course we're going to know about menopause because we're a woman that's going to go through it. But actually the education and knowledge around menopause can be relatively limited, and often people really understand and discover what menopause really is when they're right in the midst of trying to deal with exactly those kind of symptoms. So everything we can do to provide that education and support so people know what's going on can make a big difference.
In your experience in your work with Henpicked, how much do organisations currently pay enough attention to their menopausal staff members?
I think we've seen a real progress in this journey and this conversation in workplaces, certainly over the last few months. If you look back around 5 years ago, it was hard to find any organisations that had really recognised this, that were willing to talk about it. And whereas you look now, it's starting to become more rare for organisations, at least not to have this on the agenda, to start recognising. And as we talked about, this is the fastest growing workforce demographic, and such an important part of our workplace. And one of the most shocking statistics when we look at the impact of menopause at work and some of the research that's been done is that 1 in 4 women actually consider leaving work because of their symptoms. And sometimes it's a bit of a hidden reason, and that understanding is this actually a reason why we are losing that valuable resource from our organisation? So everything, as say, we can do to make this a conversation that's okay to talk about. And we're finding, as say, more and more organisations, rather than just looking at, okay, we're going to run an awareness session about menopause, is how do we truly embed this, that this is something that we are comfortable talking about. People feel they have permission, that it's okay to kind of show up at work as their real selves and share exactly those kind of stories that you've shared there of how this is impacting. Because when we have that honesty and those sharing of stories and experiences, it helps that collective environment to be able to say, it's okay to share this, it's okay to talk about it, and it's okay to reach out for help when it's needed.
And architecture really can't afford to lose women to this, because there's so few women in the profession as it is. This openness, if you like, the element of taboo around talking about it. Yes, Davina did a Channel 4 programme, and, you know, we're starting to open up the conversation. But for some, even those, you know, even women, they don't want to talk about it. So how do we get over that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important that we provide a way for people to access information and talking about this in a way that feels comfortable and safe for them. We can't expect everyone to want to talk about this in the same way. Some people can feel very open and wanting to share their stories. Others it feels very private. But also it's many of the associations we have from menopause. If we look back historically, menopause came at quite a different time in life, and in particular, a very different time in working life. So we go back around 100 years ago, the average age of menopause was 57. The average life expectancy for a woman was 59. So menopause was very much associated with old age towards the end of life. And many of those associations have carried forward today, even though as we've talked about, that average age is 51. Average age of life expectancy is 83. And we have a 1 in 6, 1 in 7 chance of living to be 100. So menopause now is very much coming at that halfway point. But many of our associations of menopause are hot, tired, angry, and old. And when that's our perceptions of menopause, it can feel really uncomfortable putting your hand up at work and saying, actually, do you know what? That's me. So one of the things that we like to really try and challenge within organisations is actually how we talk about menopause. If you looked around your organisations, if you looked around the people you work with who are potentially women going through menopause, I'm sure it's a very different set of words you would use to describe them as capable, wise, experienced, knowledgeable. And that's where we want to try and help to change the culture within an organisation of how we talk about and how we view those going through menopause. So for those where this may feel quite uncomfortable, it starts to feel that actually it is acceptable to put your hand up and say, actually, do you know what, that's me. But again, as you say, making sure this is done in a way that feels comfortable and safe for the individual. So it's the right way for that person to be able to share their experience if they want to.
So what does that look like, you know, making that space safe for women? What would you advise?
I think that there's a mixture of things that we can do. I think initially ensuring that it's clear how you support people going through menopause. And I think having that clarity, knowing that the organisation you work for has that vision as to what, or strategy as to what is going to be in place and the way that menopause could be supported. Education is a massive piece, so making sure managers in particular are educated and have that understanding around how somebody could be experiencing this work and the way that somebody might need help and support. But also educating managers and getting them to think about the skills that they use in opening up conversations about lots of other different things, in the way that they might support people through other things they're going through, whether it's mental health issues or other medical conditions people are experiencing. You know, these can be sensitive topics, and we shouldn't be prescribing how someone experiences this. We shouldn't be saying to somebody and diagnosing, oh, is it menopause? Do you think you're menopausal? We know that's not a good way of opening this conversation. So asking those supportive, open questions, how someone is, that real check-in. And the check-in twice of when we ask someone how you are, it's so easy to respond, well, I'm fine, but actually a real check-in. Noticing the things that you see in people that are maybe different to you've seen before, so reflecting back how you might see menopause showing itself at work, and actually then asking those important questions, what can we do to help? How can we help? And I think then also thinking about the different ways that you could potentially reach different people. So a lot of organisations provide support groups, so allowing people to be able to share their experiences with other people that are also going through this in the same kind of work environment, so that feeling of not feeling on their own. But also understanding some of the barriers. So we've done work in organisations where there have been particular barriers to accessing this material, and it's understanding, well, what are those barriers, working with network groups within organisations to try and clarify, well, we know this particular group within our organisation isn't accessing or getting involved in this conversation. Why not? We've seen things around language barriers, we've seen things around cultural barriers, and trying to understand those so we can then start to think about, well, how should we be doing this in a way that feels supportive to everybody?
We're talking the menopause with Sally Leach of Henpicked. Tomorrow we have another day on CQ strategy, a brilliant hour planned, if I say so myself. I wonder who put that together. It's talk about decolonisation with Dr Neil Chassor, Professor Corinne Fowler, who's the academic behind the National Trust work, and the student group Decolonise Architecture. So it should be a really good, rich discussion about that. Yesterday, I was joined by Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell Tabs and Christina Riley, and we talked about LGBTQ plus lives. And you'll be able to catch up with the subtitled video as soon as we can get it accurately and accessibly up on RIBA's YouTube channel, hopefully within the next day. It was a really, really insightful and useful conversation. Right now, we're talking the menopause with Sally Leach of Henpicked. Sally, tell me a bit about Henpicked and what sort of support do you provide?
Yeah, so our goal is very much to support organisations in how to open this conversation in a way that feels right for the organisation. There's not a one size fits all. So we work very much in partnership with organisations, looking both from a strategic point of view. So what is the overall goal and drive behind opening this conversation, understanding the context and the culture of that organisation. And then we look at what strategies would be best to put in place. Most of what we do in organisations is led by education, so around training both for general awareness to open the conversation, but training and support for managers, because managers play such an important role in this. Often the first person somebody may go to if they're needing help and support may be their manager. And a lot of the time we find with managers there is a bit of a fear around these conversations, worry that people might say the wrong thing or approach it in the wrong way. So it's all about building that confidence and skill set, because managers don't need to be menopause experts. That's not the role of the manager. It's about having some core knowledge and understanding and appreciation, and then being able to use those great management skills and coaching skills to be able to support someone and ask what can be done to help, and being open-minded and flexible to the kinds of things that could make a big difference for somebody. We also, in some organisations, look at how we then create sustainability. So we work with organisations where we may train a group of advocates or trainers to be able to keep this conversation going, because one of the things we're finding very much as this conversation's opening further within workplaces is how is this fully embedded? So how is this integrated into other training, into other policies? So this becomes just a normal thing to support in the same ways we support about so many other things. And there's work to be done on that, but that's definitely the way we're seeing many organisations. It's looking at the more longer term, how do we keep this conversation going to ensure we are retaining and attracting that really important part of our workforce.
Now, how important is leadership when, taking responsibility for how an organisation moves forward for menopause? Because especially in architecture and the built environment, it's a very male-dominated leadership demographic. So what do we need from them?
Well, we definitely find the most powerful sessions that we run will often be opened by a senior leader from within an organisation, and that could be either a male or a female senior leader. And we just find having different voices on this journey, so that this isn't just about somebody going through menopause. Menopause can actually have an impact on everybody. It could have an impact on somebody going through it directly. It can have an impact on relationships, families, colleagues, friends. So this is a conversation for everyone. So having that male voice can really, really help. But having that senior leader voice, whatever gender, really helps to give the permission of the organisation that this is something that's a priority. So we definitely think that engagement of senior leaders and helping them to understand the huge benefits that this has in terms of the looking at the demographics and how we retain and attract, looking at the really clear business case of ensuring that this is a priority in organisations, that social responsibility that we have to think about how we're looking after people and allowing people to be their best selves at work. And then we also have some legal responsibilities, so ensuring those senior managers have that understanding. We remember one session that we ran, it was a face-to-face live session pre-COVID, and one of the senior female leaders was talking. It was actually not a session just specifically on menopause, and she just kind of started a session kind of talking through her symptoms. Well, today I'm ridiculously hot, my makeup's running down my face, and I'm exhausted because I've not slept. That's the menopause for me at the moment. And she said it was like an organisational sigh of relief that actually, wow, we're talking about this, thank goodness. And so that's what we often find by having that senior leader voice can really, as I say, help to open and pave the way that this is an okay conversation to be having.
And it's okay to have a laugh as well, isn't it? Because actually,
absolutely. Sometimes we have to. There's a fantastic YouTube video that talks about the loss of nouns as being one of the menopause symptoms. And this American comedian talks about it. And she said, I've got adjectives coming out my ears. But she said, there's a chair over there. She can tell you what size it is, what shape it is, what you do with it. But can I remember the word for a chair? Not a chance. So yeah, we do absolutely. We need to be careful in the workplace that it doesn't become the kind of butt of jokes, that it's not considered acceptable, that we can, use kind of humour inappropriately. But absolutely, there are times, especially for those going through it, where we just have to laugh at what our body is throwing at us.
When we look at what good looks like, for you, how would you describe that in terms of an organisation taking menopause seriously?
Well, we've had the first few organisations in the UK that have been accredited as menopause friendly through an independent panel. And that looks at kind of 6 key areas. So it looks at culture, it looks at training, it looks at policies and guidance and how it's really kind of implemented within organisations. It looks at communication and engagement, because one of the key things is it can be great to have a wonderful policy and guidance document. It can be great to have lots of great intranet content and information, but is that really reaching everybody? We had a great story of we did a public session that was for anyone that was going through menopause to kind of share their experiences. And someone talked about they wish their organisation did some things about menopause. And we found out what organisation they worked for. And we actually knew this particular organisation did loads about menopause, but obviously it hadn't reached this individual. And when we highlighted it to them, they were amazed. So although we can feel as an organisation we may be doing lots, but is that reaching people? So that's a really key critical part. Another area that organisations tend to look at that are doing really well in this space is facilities. So whether that's to do with the space people are in, to do with the roles that they play, even things like workwear, uniforms, and thinking about how are those menopause friendly, because the research tells us, as well as symptoms impacting on work, our workplace environment, and there are certain workplace aspects that can really make symptoms really exacerbated. So having considerations around that. And then the biggest parts that kind of hold all this together is measuring the impact. So how do you know this conversation is happening, and how do you know there is that change where it feels that this is a normal conversation in your organisation? That's what we really look for organisations to really measure the impact of the work they're doing.
So how do you do that? How do you measure impact?
And that's a challenge, I think, that we do recognise. I think one of the big things is some of the softer measures. So what conversations are you hearing around your organisation around menopause? I remember, again, one of the organisations that's very much been leading and is one of the accredited, recognised as accredited menopause friendly organisations at HSBC UK. And they said when they knew this was changing, as they were walking down the corridor and they could hear conversations happening about menopause, and it was just normal. No one batted an eyelid. It wasn't considered an unusual conversation, and that really showed that cultural change. We also think there are more kind of concrete measures around when you're running sessions, how many people are engaging in those. We see organisations measuring the hits to intranet content and showing that the content they're creating is really reaching many people. We also actually asking, through things like employee surveys or temperature checks over a period of time, how comfortable do people feel talking about menopause at work? Would somebody feel they knew what their organisation did to support, and does that change over a period of time as people put strategies in place? So there are lots of different ways, but the conversations happening, and also the feedback. We've had some really powerful feedback from people saying that the difference this has made to their lives, because they have learned about menopause from their workplace, they have then got the help and support they needed, and they are now feeling they are able to be their best at work. But it also has that huge impact outside of work on their relationships, on their families. So this is something that we can really make a difference in people's lives.
We're talking to Sally Leach of Henpicked about the menopause, and we'll have more from her. You're listening to RIBA Radio live from the bookshop at 66 Portland Place. You know what? I think I've done really, really well. We got to day 5 and, you know, we've had very few technical little mishaps, but, you know, it happens. And hopefully you've enjoyed listening to RIBA Radio so far without the mishaps. But it all makes for live radio, right? Makes it all, keep it real. That's what I'm all about. Yeah. Thanks for the sounds of encouragement from the team here in the bookshop. We've been talking menopause with Sally Leach of Henpicked, but before we go back to her, I'd really like to tell you about my soundtrack that's coming up a little bit later between 5 and 6. We have invited 7 special guests from across the worlds of architecture, design and culture, and they've pre-recorded a special music hour each day. Our guest presenters are sharing personal stories, unique insights. They've reflected their choice of top tunes coming from across the musical spectrum. Today, it's Emre Turkman, and Emre's a London-based producer and songwriter, and he began making music, you know, just with a little 8-track recorder and a guitar in his home studio whilst he was studying architecture. And he spent loads of time here at 66 Portland Place in the library. So later, if you tune in between 5 and 6, you can hear how he went from working in an architect's office to forming the band Years and Years, recording platinum-selling singles like King and the album Communion. And I have to say, he was in. Well, when I say my office, no one has an office right now. The room that I book and have requisitioned and got a little radio studio in at the moment, when he was in there, I'm glad I didn't really know who he was, because I probably would have been all over him, because I just love Years and Years. I just think they're brilliant. Earlier we were talking about inclusive recruitment with Dr Susy Ridout of Oxford Brookes and Pooja Agrawal of Public Practice and Dr Binna Kandola of Pearn Kandola. It was a really, really useful, practical discussion. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, if you want to ensure that you do recruitment in an inclusive way, you have to put in time and effort. If you want to hire diversity of staff and ensure an inclusive culture, this is about time, effort, money, expertise. That was the other thing they mentioned, was how, you know, you really ought to be trained to do recruitment properly and willing, you know, that motivation to do it well. So please listen back, because there's some really good, useful, practical tips, and all of that will be repeated on this listen live link as we come off live broadcast. We're live in the bookshop here at 66 Portland Place, so you're going to hear the movement of people and the way they're going about their work as well. We're talking to Sally Leach of Henpicked. Henpicked is a menopause support consultancy for organisations, etc. And Sally, how do you end up in menopause work and supporting others?
Yeah, so it was really interesting, my kind of journey to this. So my background originally is HR. So I worked in large corporates, and after having children, decided I wanted some more flexibility. And at that time, it was often quite difficult to get that. So I stepped away and actually started to work in women's health and trained, focusing on pre and postnatal health. That was my kind of area. And I came to menopause because one of my closest friends who worked in an engineering company, so very male-dominated environment, who was incredibly vibrant, amazing career, had really achieved a huge amount in what was quite a challenging workplace for women. And she just suddenly was struggling with everything. She was struggling to be able to get out of bed in the morning. She was struggling to get to work, struggling to function. Lovely, wonderful family, and she was finding she didn't want to spend any time with anyone, do anything, and this really had a huge impact. And she was diagnosed with severe depression and signed off work and had to take time out, to the point where she actually admitted herself into hospital because she was in such a dark place. And it was only somebody who was part of her care team that actually identified and asked that question around whether menopause or hormones could be playing a role, because a lot of the treatment she was getting in terms of managing it through antidepressants just wasn't working. And I felt really blindsided by this. She was one of my closest friends. I worked in women's health and I had no idea of the potential impact this could have. So I started researching, learning, and then as with my background in HR, actually understanding and appreciating potentially this is having a really big impact, because we do a lot of work and we see a lot of work in the space around diversity inclusion and looking at how we challenge some of the gender challenges within organisations around maternity, childcare and all of those responsibilities. And I remember talking to a professor at the University of Oxford, and she was saying that she worked a lot around understanding, well, what is it that actually causes some of the gender gaps within the workplace? And she said, again, she just completely missed that menopause could even be part of this. But actually, as we understand and appreciate and see challenges like we're facing that we talked about earlier around the amount of people that are potentially leaving at that really critical point that we don't want to be losing, and actually that realization, actually, do you know what? Menopause is potentially a really hidden factor that we need to start talking about, because this is happening to people. And actually, we've really seen when organisations get this right, the huge difference it makes to not losing that talent and actually attracting new talent of people that see. So she's now, my friend is really happy to report, having got the right treatment and the right diagnosis, she is now back in work. She is now at her best, but in a different organisation. And she just said, if that previous organisation had understood and appreciated and given her a bit more time, they could have kept her and kept that amazing talent. And that's a real loss for them. And it was a real challenging situation. So we do need to have that awareness. For some, this can be really significant, but having that time and space to be able to get the treatment that's needed will pay dividends in terms of keeping that important talent.
And it's not just women, though, when it comes to hormonal changes. I mean, I think it's to some extent, it might be worth recognising, I don't know if Henpicked helps with this at all, but men can go through some hormonal changes as well. It's called the andropause, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So we cover this when we're doing training, because we think it's so important that we do recognise hormonal changes can happen to all of us at various points. And our hormones play such a big role in how well we feel. And when they're out of balance, that they're can cause challenges. And the big difference between andropause and menopause is, for the majority, so an otherwise healthy male would go through andropause. It's a very kind of almost quite an unnoticeable change, because it's such a slow, gentle decline and change in hormones that it's not something that would bring about menopause type symptoms, because menopause happens over quite a condensed period of time and it's huge fluctuations in hormones. But there are conditions or reasons why men could experience menopause type symptoms. So things like testosterone deficiency syndrome, really common symptoms, are almost identical to menopause. So if any men that are listening, anyone that you know is experiencing these kind of symptoms, always so important to go and check with a GP, understand what's causing it, because there are treatments available and people shouldn't be struggling and suffering through that. Also, side effects from certain treatments. So as well as treatments that women may be going through for cancer, things like hormone therapy for prostate cancer, really common side effect of hot flushes, night sweats, not being able to sleep. And we also need to have consideration around people, transgender, non-binary people, that recognition not everyone who goes through menopause may identify as a woman. And we need to think about how we can be inclusive in the language that we're talking about menopause, so that everyone can feel part of this conversation. And no matter what reason somebody's going through hormonal changes that are bringing about menopause type symptoms, is what can we do to help and support them at work?
And it's really important, isn't it, that actually the first port of call is a medical professional.
Absolutely. The challenges that we can sometimes have is that the experience people have when they're reaching out to get that medical support can be very different. But absolutely, that first line approach, and we'd really recommend, is talking to the GP. And there are lots of things that we can do as an individual to ensure that we're getting the best from the GP, because if we think about our GPs, they are general practitioners. They have a huge amount of pressure. We know the huge pressures the NHS is under at the moment. And so we need to recognise that some GPs may not have a huge amount of knowledge around menopause. And there is a lot of work being done to provide better education. But individuals can do a lot to reading things like the NICE guidelines, really great starting point to understand how menopause should be supported, and that real preparation for an appointment. So having a real clarity, well, these are my symptoms, this is why I think it's menopause, and these are the kind of things I'd like to explore from a treatment point of view, because there isn't a one size fits all. There are lots of different treatments available, but the GP is absolutely that first point of call in terms of thinking about the treatment you might want to explore.
Well, we've been speaking to Sally Leach of Henpicked about the menopause, and if you would like support and guidance, the RIBA does have guidance available through architecture.com. Find the equality, diversity and inclusion pages, scroll down on there and you will find menopause at work. We have put together a guide for staff as colleagues and a guide for line managers as well, which anybody can access. And those things that Sally was talking about there in terms of, preparing for those conversations with the GP, finding the nice guidelines, etc. It's all in there as part of the support available for you. So please do check that out when you get a chance. Tomorrow, we have another day on CQ strategy, and it's going to be an extraordinary humdinger of a day, I have to say. We've got Bristol Mayor Marvin Rees, we've got Baroness Doreen Lawrence, we've got Dr Neil Chassor and Professor Corinne Fowler talking about decolonisation. We have Indy Johar. Quite simply, you wouldn't want to miss it. It's going to be fabulous. Each entry will receive a limited edition booklet that folds out in a unique way to reveal a striking and beautifully designed A2 poster with 10 top tips for inclusion. It's an absolute must for your office wall. Now, I've got one in my hand right now. And the way it folds out, I can't even describe it, I'm afraid, because, I know radio is a theatre of the mind. But if you can, just imagine an A2 poster that's folded almost in triangles. And on one side, when you open it up, it actually says in incredible variety of typography, the word inclusion. But on the other side, we've got these 10 top tips, which I've penned together myself, which includes starting with CQ. That's your first thing that you need to have, is consider taking a CQ assessment so you can figure out how good you are at working relating with those who are different from you. And the other thing I've mentioned is, who are your friends? Who are the people that you surround yourself with? Really consider who that might be. 3, feel the fear and do it anyway. CQ Drive. Really look back at what we were talking about on Friday. So have a look at the video on the YouTube site as well. Listen to others who are really different from you as well. I do recommend that you do that, and you have a consideration of those voices that are very, very different from your own. We're covering all of this stuff on RIBA Radio, so keep tuned in. Tomorrow is going to be another cracker on RIBA Radio. We've been exploring CQ strategy on day 5. We've heard from Susy Ridout, Pooja Agrawal, Binna Kandola, Jenny Russell, Charlie Edmund, Paul Crosby, Grace Choi, Sue Ems, Elena Marco, Sally Leach. It's been amazing. Thank you for listening to day 5 of RIBA Radio. We've got more coming up exactly like that tomorrow, the penultimate day of RIBA Radio.
You've been listening to RIBA Radio. Real, inclusive, brilliant action.